files. Please like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where are you watching from tonight. Get comfortable, relax, and let's begin. My wife's been dead 10 years. But last night, she called my name from the attic. 43 years I wore the badge in Millbrook County. 43 years of domestic disputes, bar fights, teenagers spray painting the water tower, and the occasional methamphetamine operation run out of some trailer deep in the pines. Small-town crime for a small-town sheriff. Nothing that required more than common sense and a steady hand. But there was one case, if you can call it that still sits heavy in my chest like a stone. Makes me check the vents in my own house before I sleep. Makes me wonder if retirement was the right choice, or if I just ran out of courage to face what was stirring in the shadows of my town. It started with the Henderson place. The Hendersons had lived on Maple Street for 15 years. Good people. Tom worked at the grain elevator. Sarah taught 3rd grade at the elementary school. 2 kids, a boy named Michael who played Little League, and a girl named Emma who collected beetles in mason jars. The kind of family that made you believe in something decent still existing in the world. I'd known them to wave from their porch when I drove patrol. Never had cause to visit their house until that Tuesday morning in October when Sarah called the station. Voice shaking like autumn leaves. "Sheriff," she said, "there's something wrong with our house." I've heard that phrase before. Usually means a broken window or a busted water pipe. Sometimes it means domestic trouble, and the person on the other end is looking for an excuse to get help without admitting what's really happening. "What kind of wrong, Sarah?" The silence stretched so long I thought the line had gone dead. Then, "It's talking to us. Through the heating vents." I pulled into their driveway 20 minutes later. The Henderson house looked like every other 2-story colonial on Maple Street. White siding, black shutters, a front porch with hanging baskets of flowers that Sarah tended to with the dedication of a nun. But something felt different as I walked up their front steps. The air seemed thicker somehow, like breathing through wet cotton. Sarah answered the door before I knocked. Her face was pale, circles under her eyes dark as bruises. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. "Thank you for coming," she said, stepping aside to let me in. The house smelled wrong. Not dirty or moldy, but wrong in a way I couldn't name. Like old pennies and sweet milk left in the sun. The kind of smell that makes your throat close up without you realizing it. Tom was in the living room, sitting on the edge of their couch with his elbows on his knees. He looked up when I entered, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not fear exactly, but the hollow look of a man who'd stopped trusting his own senses. "Tell me what's happening," I said. They looked at each other, some wordless communication passing between them. Sarah sat down next to her husband, close enough that their knees touched. "It started about a week ago," Tom said. "At night, after we'd gone to bed, we heard voices coming through the heating vents." "What kind of voices?" "Our voices," Sarah whispered. "Mine and Tom's. Sometimes the kids. Having conversations we never had." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "And you're sure it's not sound carrying from another room? Sometimes ventilation systems can play tricks." "We checked," Tom interrupted. "We've checked everything. The whole family was in the living room when we heard Sarah's voice coming from the kitchen vent, asking Tom to come help her with something. But Sarah was sitting right there next to me." Sarah's hands were trembling in her lap. "Yesterday, the kids heard my voice calling them from their bedroom vent, telling them to open their windows, that I had a surprise for them outside. But I was downstairs doing laundry." The house settled around us with small groans and sighs, the way old houses do. But every sound made Sarah flinch. Have you had any work done recently? I asked. New heating system, renovations? Nothing, Tom said. House is the same as it's always been. I spent the next hour going through the motions, checking windows and doors, looking for signs of forced entry, examining the heating vents for tampering. The metalwork was original to the house, painted over so many times the screws had nearly disappeared under layers of white enamel. No signs of recent disturbance. The basement was where things started to feel truly wrong. The furnace was an old gas unit, probably installed in the 80s. Adequate for the size of the house, but nothing special. The ductwork spread out from it like arteries, disappearing into the walls and up to the floors above. Everything looked normal, but that smell was stronger down here, that sweet, metallic odor that made my sinuses ache. I found myself listening. Really listening, in a way I hadn't done since my army days when silence could mean the difference between making it home and not. The basement was quiet except for the occasional tick of cooling metal and the whisper of air moving through the ducts. Then I heard it. Faint, but unmistakable. A voice drifting through the ductwork. A woman's voice, soft and pleading. Tom? Tom, can you hear me? I need you to open the door. I looked up at the ceiling. Tom and Sarah were both upstairs in the kitchen. I could hear their footsteps and muffled conversation. But the voice in the vents sounded exactly like Sarah. Please, Tom. I'm scared. Open the door. The voice faded, replaced by the normal sounds of air circulation. I stood there for a long moment, flashlight in hand, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. But my hands were shaking, and there was a cold sweat on my forehead that had nothing to do with the basement temperature. I went back upstairs and found Tom and Sarah exactly where I'd left them, sitting at the kitchen table. They looked at me with desperate hope, like I might have some rational explanation that would make their world make sense again. Have you considered staying somewhere else for a few days? I asked. Maybe with relatives? We can't, Sarah said. Tom's mother is in California, and my sister lives in Nashville. Besides, what would we tell people? That our house is talking to us? I understood. In a town like Millbrook, that kind of story would follow them forever. People would either think they were crazy or making it up for attention. Neither option was appealing. Let me do some research, I said. In the meantime, maybe consider sleeping downstairs. Keep the kids close. I left them my card and my cell phone number, though I wasn't sure what help I could offer. On the drive back to the station, I found myself thinking about the voice I'd heard in the basement. The desperation in it, the way it had called Tom's name like a prayer. That night, I sat in my home office with a cup of coffee and my laptop, searching for anything that might explain what was happening at the Henderson house. I found articles about auditory hallucinations, shared psychotic episodes, carbon monoxide poisoning. Nothing that felt right. Around midnight my phone rang. Sheriff? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. It's happening again. But this time it's different. Different how? It's not just our voices anymore. It's my grandmother's voice. She's been dead for 12 years, but she's calling to me through the vent in Emma's room. She's saying she's lost and needs me to let her in. I was already reaching for my keys. I'm on my way. The Henderson house at midnight was a different creature entirely. The comfortable family home I'd visited that morning had transformed into something crouched and waiting. Every window was lit, casting long rectangles of yellow light across the lawn. As I walked up the front steps, I could hear voices, multiple voices, coming from inside the house. Sarah met me at the door. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes wild. It's everywhere, she said. Every vent in the house. They're all talking at once. I followed her inside and immediately understood what she meant. The house was full of voices, whispered conversations drifting from heating vents in every room. I could make out words here and there, fragments of sentences that sounded like family members calling to each other, asking for help, begging to be let in. Tom was upstairs with the children, who were huddled together in the master bedroom, the only room where the voices seemed quieter. Emma, who couldn't have been more than 8, looked up at me with solemn eyes. "The bad voices want us to open the doors," she said matter-of-factly. "But we're not supposed to." "That's right," I told her. "You're being very smart." Michael, a year older than his sister, was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall. "They sound like people we know," he said. "But they're not. They're pretending. Children sometimes see things more clearly than adults. They haven't learned yet that the world is supposed to make sense." I spent the rest of the night at the Henderson house, listening to the voices that emerged from every heating vent. They came in waves, sometimes a single voice calling softly, sometimes multiple voices overlapping until they became an incomprehensible chorus. All of them pleading, begging, demanding to be let in. Sarah's grandmother wasn't the only dead person speaking through the vents. Tom heard his father, who died in a car accident 6 years earlier. The children heard their great-uncle Bill, who'd passed away when they were toddlers. All of them using the same words, the same desperate tone. "Please! I'm lost. I need you to open the door." As dawn approached, the voices gradually faded until the house fell silent. The Henderson family slept fitfully in the master bedroom while I sat guard in a chair by the window, watching the sun rise over Maple Street and trying to make sense of what I'd witnessed. I called in sick to work that day and spent it at the county library, digging through local history records. The Henderson house had been built in 1967 on land that had previously been a cornfield. Before that, it had been part of a larger farm owned by the Garrett family. The Garretts had sold off parcels of land throughout the 1950s and 60s as the town expanded. I found a newspaper article from 1952 about a fire at the original Garrett farmhouse. 3 people had died, an elderly woman and 2 children who'd been trapped in the basement when the house burned. The cause was listed as a faulty heating system. The article included a quote from one of the survivors, a young woman named Margaret Garrett. "We could hear them calling to us from inside the house, begging us to open the doors and let them out. But the fire was too hot. We couldn't get to them." I stared at that quote for a long time, remembering Emma's words. "The bad voices want us to open the doors." That evening, I returned to the Henderson house with a plan. I'd spent the afternoon researching heating contractors and found one in the next county who specialized in old systems. He'd agreed to come out that night and inspect their furnace, free of charge. The contractor's name was Bill Hutchinson. He was a thin man in his 60s with calloused hands and the kind of quiet competence that comes from decades of practical work. He listened to my explanation without interruption, nodding occasionally. "Old heating systems can do funny things," he said. "Especially if there's been any settling in the foundation or changes in the ductwork over the years." He spent 2 hours in the basement with his tools and his flashlight. When he came back upstairs, his face was troubled. "I've never seen anything like it," he said. "The ductwork is fine, the furnace is operating normally, but there's something else down there." "What kind of something?" "Come see for yourself." I followed him back to the basement. He led me to the far corner, where the main duct disappeared into the wall. He'd removed a section of the ductwork, revealing the space behind. "Look," he said, shining his flashlight into the opening. The light revealed a small chamber that had been hidden behind the wall, a space that hadn't appeared on any of the house's blueprints. Inside were 3 shapes that had once been people, reduced now to bones and scraps of clothing. They were positioned as if they'd been trying to crawl toward the ductwork, reaching for something they couldn't quite grasp. "The original farmhouse foundation," Hutchinson said quietly. "This was built right on top of it. When they poured the new basement, they must have sealed off part of the old cellar." I understood then. The voices weren't coming from the heating system at all. They were coming from the people who died in the fire 60 years ago, trapped in a pocket of the old basement that had been forgotten and sealed away. Somehow, the ductwork had given them a way to speak to the living world above. We called the county coroner and the state police. The removal of the remains took most of the next day. As the last of the bones were carried out, the house seemed to exhale, a long, slow release of tension that I felt in my chest. That night, the Henderson house was silent. I visited them a week later. Sarah was in her garden, planting bulbs for next spring. She looked up when I approached, and for the first time since I'd known her, she smiled. "No more voices," she said. "Whatever you did, it worked." I'd filed my report as a routine matter. Old remains discovered during maintenance, likely victims of a house fire from decades past. No mention of voices or supernatural occurrences. Some things don't belong in official paperwork. But I kept thinking about what the contractor had said, about the way the bones had been positioned, reaching toward the ductwork as if they'd been trying to escape. Or as if they'd been trying to call for help through the only pathway available to them. The Hendersons stayed in their house for another 3 years before Tom got a job offer in Denver. They moved away quietly, selling to a young couple from the city who'd been looking for a place to start their family. I sometimes wonder if they know the history of their home, or if the silence will hold. I retired 2 years after the Henderson case, but I still drive down Maple Street sometimes. The house looks peaceful enough in the daylight, with its fresh coat of paint and the new owner's garden taking shape in the front yard. Children's toys scattered on the lawn, a swing set in the backyard. But I never drive past at night. Because 43 years of police work taught me that some things don't stay buried, and some voices don't stay silent just because we want them to. The boundary between the living and the dead is thinner than most people realize, and sometimes what we build on top of the past doesn't erase it. It just gives it new ways to reach us. Last week, I got a call from the current owners of the Henderson house. Young woman, voice shaking like autumn leaves. "Sheriff," she said, "there's something wrong with our house." I sat in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, listening to the familiar fear in her voice. Outside, the wind was picking up, and I could hear it moving through the vents of my own house, a soft, whispering sound that might have been nothing more than air circulation. Or might have been something else entirely. "What kind of wrong?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "It's talking to us," she whispered, "through the heating vents." I closed my eyes and thought about the 3 shapes we'd found in that hidden chamber, reaching toward the ductwork with desperate, grasping fingers. I thought about voices calling through the darkness, begging to be heard, to be remembered, to be let in. Some things don't stay buried. Some voices don't stay silent. And some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. My wife's been dead 10 years. But last night, she called my name from the attic, her voice drifting down through the heating vents like a prayer. She sounded lost, frightened. She said she needed me to open the door. I'm still sitting here in my kitchen, listening to the wind move through the vents of my house. Still trying to decide whether the voice I heard was real, or just the echo of too many years spent listening to the desperate pleas of the dead. But I know one thing for certain. I'm not going to open that door. Some voices are meant to stay on the other side of silence. Some doors are meant to stay closed. And some secrets are better left buried in the foundations of our homes, where they can whisper to us through the vents but never quite reach us in the light of day. The phone is ringing again. Probably the new owners of the Henderson house, calling to tell me the voices have gotten louder. Calling to ask me what they should do when the voices start sounding like people they love, people they've lost, people who just want to come home. I'm going to let it ring. Because 43 years of wearing a badge taught me that some cases don't have solutions, and some mysteries are meant to stay mysterious. Sometimes the best thing you can do is walk away and let the dead keep their secrets. But I'll keep driving past that house on Maple Street, watching for signs, listening for whispers. Because even in retirement, even with my badge locked away in a drawer, I'm still the sheriff of Millbrook County. And some responsibilities don't end just because you stop getting paid for them. The voices in the vents are patient. They've been waiting 60 years to be heard. They can wait a little longer. You hear the wet slap of it dragging itself up your steps. And by the time you check, it's already in the house. That's what Mrs. Henderson told me that Tuesday morning in October, 43 years ago. I was sheriff then, had been for going on 15 years, and I thought I'd heard every kind of strange tale this county could produce. The old woman sat across from my desk, her hands shaking as she wrapped them around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour before. The fluorescent lights in my office buzzed like dying insects, casting that sickly yellow glow that made everyone look like they were coming down with something. Millbrook County had always been the kind of place where stories grew in the dark spaces between what people knew and what they were afraid to admit they'd seen. Nestled in the Appalachian foothills, our little town of Cedar Falls had been carved out of forest and creek bottom back when the railroad still ran through here. By the time I took the badge, the trains had stopped coming, the mill had closed, and most folks under 30 had moved on to places with better prospects. What remained was a collection of weathered houses, old families with older secrets, and the kind of silence that settles over a place when it's been forgotten by the wider world. Mrs. Henderson lived alone in the yellow house on Sycamore Street, the one with the wraparound porch that faced Bitter Creek. Her husband had passed 3 winters prior, leaving her with a pension, a garden, and the kind of solitude that can turn shadows into monsters if you're not careful. But she wasn't the hysterical type. Martha Henderson had taught school for 37 years, had raised 4 children, and had a backbone straight as a fence post. If she said something had dragged itself up her steps, then something had. The thing was, she wasn't the first. 2 weeks earlier, young Tommy Brewster had come running into town, his face white as paper, babbling about something that had left what looked like shed skin all over his grandmother's porch. Old Mrs. Brewster lived in the greenhouse on Elm, maybe a quarter-mile from where Bitter Creek curved around the old Methodist cemetery. The boy was 14, prone to tall tales and too much time spent reading those horror magazines, so I'd filed his story away with all the other ghost stories and unexplained noises that seemed to multiply when the leaves started turning. But then came the Kowalski incident. Frank Kowalski was a retired mechanic, a man who measured his words like he measured engine oil, and he swore that something had pressed itself against his bedroom window one night, leaving what he described as skin marks on the glass. His house sat on Creek Road, backing up to the water like most of the older homes in town. When I drove out to take a look, I found smears on the window that looked like someone had dragged a wet cloth across the surface, except the marks were too uniform, too deliberate. They formed a pattern that reminded me of fingerprints, if fingerprints were the size of dinner plates. Cedar Falls had always had what you might call an uneasy relationship with Bitter Creek. The water ran year-round, fed by springs that bubbled up from deep in the mountain, and it had a way of staying just a few degrees colder than it should, even in the height of summer. Old-timers said the water tasted different too, with a mineral flavor that lingered on your tongue long after you'd swallowed. My grandfather, who'd been sheriff before me, used to tell stories about things that lived in the deeper pools, but I chalked that up to the kind of folklore that springs up around any body of water that's been around long enough. The creek meandered through town like a lazy snake, touching the backyards of maybe 24 houses before disappearing into the forest on the far side of the valley. Most folks kept their distance from the water after dark, not because of any specific fear, but because of that nameless unease that settles over certain places when the sun goes down. The creek bottom was lined with smooth stones that had been worn round by centuries of flowing water, and the banks were thick with willows and wild grapevines that grew so dense in places that you couldn't see more than a few feet into the undergrowth. After Mrs. Henderson's visit, I started making regular drives along Creek Road, checking on the houses that backed up to the water. It became a habit, part of my evening routine. I'd drive slowly, windows down, listening to the sound of the water moving over the stones and watching for anything that seemed out of place. The October air carried the smell of wood smoke and dying leaves, and there was something else underneath it, something that reminded me of the way a cellar smells after it's been closed up for too long. It was during one of these drives that I first noticed the sounds. Not the normal creek sounds, the gurgle of water over rocks, the splash of a fish jumping, the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. This was different. It was a sliding sound, like something heavy being dragged across wet stones. It would start downstream, somewhere beyond where I could see, and move slowly upstream, passing behind the houses one by one. The sound was always accompanied by a smell, faint but unmistakable, like the inside of an old rubber boot that had been left in a damp basement. I started timing it. The sound would begin just after full dark, around 7:30 in those shortened October days, and it would take maybe 20 minutes to move from the downstream end of town to where the creek curved toward the cemetery. It was methodical, predictable, and completely wrong. Nothing natural moved that slowly, that deliberately, through water that was barely 2 feet deep in most places. The reports started coming in more frequently after that. Sarah Chin, who lived in the blue house with the screened porch, found what she described as shed skin covering her outdoor furniture one morning. It was translucent, almost like cellophane, but thicker and with a texture that reminded her of the way a snake's skin feels when it's still damp. The residue clung to everything it touched and left a greasy film that was nearly impossible to wash off. Pete Morrison discovered similar material draped over his woodpile, and Mrs. Garrett found it wrapped around the posts of her clothesline like Christmas tinsel. Each incident occurred at a house that backed up to the creek, and each one happened on a night when I'd heard that slow, sliding sound moving through the water. I started keeping a log, marking down the dates and times, drawing connections between the reports and the sounds. What emerged was a pattern that made my skin crawl. The thing, and by then I was certain it was a thing, not just a collection of coincidences, moved upstream every night, but it only left its calling cards at certain houses. There was no obvious logic to the selection. The houses weren't clustered together, they weren't all owned by people of a certain age or background, and they didn't share any architectural features that I could identify. The only thing they had in common was that they'd all been built before 1925, back when the creek ran deeper and faster, before the drought of 31 and the flood of 38 had changed its course. I spent hours at the county courthouse, digging through old records and property deeds, trying to understand what might connect these particular houses. What I found was a story that had been buried under layers of bureaucracy and forgotten by everyone except the creek itself. In 1924, a man named Ezra Whitmore had owned a considerable stretch of land along the creek, including the lots where most of the affected houses now stood. Whitmore had been what people called a hermit, living alone in a cabin that sat right on the water's edge, subsisting on fish from the creek and vegetables from a garden that he fertilized with something that made the plants grow unnaturally large and vigorous. The records were vague about what had happened to Whitmore, but there were references to a disturbance in the autumn of 1925, and his property had been sold off in parcels the following spring. The county had required that any new construction be set back at least 50 feet from the creek, a restriction that seemed arbitrary until you realized that it placed the new houses exactly where Whitmore's garden had been. The more I learned about Whitmore, the less I liked what I found. He'd been known for his peculiar habits, including a practice of hanging what appeared to be animal skins from the trees around his property. Neighbors had complained about the smell, and there were reports of strange sounds coming from his cabin at night, sliding, scraping noises that echoed across the water. But it was the final report in Whitmore's file that made me close the folder and lock it away in my desk drawer. A handwritten note from my grandfather, dated October 31st, 1925. Whitmore found dead in creek. Body in state of advanced decomposition despite recent death. Skin missing from entire torso and limbs. Medical examiner refuses to complete autopsy. Property to be cleared and sold. Creek water runs clear for first time in years. I didn't sleep well that night, or for many nights after. Every time I closed eyes, I could see that sliding thing moving through the dark water, dragging itself from pool to pool, leaving pieces of itself on the porches of houses that had been built on land where something had gone very wrong a long time ago. The reports continued through the rest of October, following the same pattern. The sliding sound in the creek, the smell like old rubber and decay, and the morning discoveries of that translucent residue clinging to porches and outdoor furniture. But as Halloween approached, something changed. The thing began staying longer at each house, and the amount of material it left behind increased. Mrs. Henderson called me again on October 29th, her voice barely above a whisper. She'd found her entire porch covered in what looked like a single, continuous sheet of the translucent material. It was draped over her porch furniture, wrapped around the railings, and stretched across the ceiling like a canopy. When she tried to remove it, the material had clung to her hands, leaving a residue that made her skin feel numb and strange. I drove out to see for myself, and what I found made me understand that we were dealing with something far beyond the usual mysteries that plagued small towns. The material on Mrs. Henderson's porch wasn't random shedding or accidental residue. It was deliberate, purposeful, arranged in a pattern that suggested intelligence and intent. The translucent sheets formed a kind of cocoon around the porch furniture, with openings that lined up perfectly with the windows of the house. It was as if something had been using the porch as a staging area, a place to prepare for the next phase of whatever it was trying to accomplish. I called in the state police, but by the time they arrived the next morning, the material had dissolved, leaving only a faint greasy stain and that lingering smell of old rubber. The investigators took pictures, collected samples of the residue, and filed a report that classified the incident as unexplained but not necessarily criminal. They left town that afternoon, probably grateful to return to crimes that made sense and suspects that had bones. But I couldn't leave. This was my town, my responsibility, and my problem to solve. On Halloween night, I parked my patrol car at the bridge on Creek Road and waited. The evening was unnaturally still, with no wind to rustle the bare branches of the willows. The creek reflected the half-moon like a broken mirror, and the water moved so slowly that it barely made a sound as it flowed over the stones. At exactly 7:30 I heard it. The sliding sound began somewhere downstream, beyond the curve where the creek disappeared into the darkness. It was louder than before, more deliberate, and accompanied by what sounded like a wet, rhythmic slapping, as if something was pulling itself forward using appendages that weren't quite suited for the task. I got out of the car and followed the sound along the creek bank, using my flashlight to illuminate the path ahead. The beam revealed nothing but dark water and smooth stones, but the sound continued, always just ahead of me, always just out of sight. As I walked, I began to notice things that hadn't been there during my previous visits. The willows along the bank were covered with what looked like cocoons, white and translucent, hanging from the branches like oversized Christmas ornaments. The stones at the water's edge were slick with a coating that reflected my flashlight beam in rainbow patterns, and the air was thick with that smell of old rubber and decay. The sound stopped abruptly when I reached the Henderson house, and I realized that I was standing in exactly the spot where Mrs. Henderson had first reported hearing something drag itself up her steps. The porch was empty now, scrubbed clean after the incident 2 days before, but as I watched, I saw something moving in the water at the edge of her backyard. It wasn't swimming, exactly, because swimming implies a certain grace and efficiency of movement. This was more like flowing, as if something without bones or muscles was propelling itself forward through sheer will. The water around it moved in ways that water shouldn't move, forming patterns that suggested the presence of something large and malleable. Something that could compress itself into narrow spaces and expand to fill larger ones. I aimed my flashlight at the water, and for just a moment, I saw it clearly. It was skin. Nothing but skin, translucent and gray-white, moving through the water like a discarded garment that had somehow developed its own sense of purpose. But this wasn't the shed skin of a snake or lizard. This was human skin, or something that had once been human, stretched and distorted until it resembled a deflated balloon more than anything that had ever contained life. As my flashlight beam hit it, the thing paused in its movement and began to rise from the water. It had no fixed shape, no permanent form, but as it emerged from the creek it seemed to gather itself into something that approximated a human silhouette. Arms that ended in boneless fingers, legs that moved like wet fabric, and a head that was nothing more than a hollow sack with 2 dark holes where eyes should have been. It began to move toward the Henderson porch, and I understood with a clarity that cut through my fear like a knife that this was what had been happening all along. The thing that had once been Ezra Whitmore, or what remained of him after whatever had happened in that cabin 75 years ago, was trying to return to the houses that had been built on his land. It was trying to get back inside. I should have run. Any sensible person would have run. But 43 years of carrying a badge had taught me that running from a problem rarely made it go away. Instead, I stepped into the water. The creek was shockingly cold, cold enough to make me gasp, and the bottom was slicker than I'd expected. But the thing stopped moving when I entered the water, as if my presence had disrupted whatever force was driving it forward. We stood there in the shallow water, separated by maybe 10 feet of space and 75 years of death, staring at each other. The thing that had been Whitmore had no eyes, but I could feel it watching me, evaluating me, trying to determine whether I was an obstacle or simply another source of the warmth and life it was seeking. When it spoke, its voice was like the sound of wind through wet leaves, barely audible above the sound of the creek flowing around us. "Cold," it said. "So cold. Let me in. Let me warm myself by your fire." I realized then that the houses weren't random targets. They were chosen because they were warm, because they contained life, because they offered something that could fill the terrible emptiness that had been left behind when Ezra Whitmore's body had been found in the creek all those years ago. "You can't have them," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Find somewhere else to be warm." The thing tilted its hollow head, and I heard something that might have been laughter if laughter could be made from the sound of water draining from a bathtub. "Already inside," it whispered. "Already warm. Already home." That's when I understood the true horror of what had been happening. The residue on the porches, the skin-like material draped over furniture and wrapped around railings. It wasn't being left behind by accident. It was being left behind on purpose, as a way of marking territory, of claiming ownership. Every house that had been touched by the thing was now connected to it, part of it, available to it whenever it chose to return. The translucent sheets weren't just shed skin, they were extensions of the creature itself, thin tendrils of its essence that allowed it to remain present even when its main body was elsewhere. Mrs. Henderson, the Kowalskis, the Chens, all the families who lived in houses that backed up to the creek, they were all living inside the creature now, surrounded by its presence, breathing air that had passed through its boneless form. The thing began to sink back into the water, dissolving like sugar in hot coffee, but its voice remained, echoing from every stone and stick along the creek bank. "See you next October, Sheriff. See you when the leaves turn and the water runs cold. See you when it's time to come home again." I stood in that freezing water for a long time after it disappeared, listening to the normal sounds of the creek returning, the gurgle of water over stones, the splash of a fish jumping, the rustle of wind through the willows. But underneath those familiar sounds, I could hear something else, something that sounded like breathing, like the slow inhalation and exhalation of something vast and patient. The report stopped after that Halloween night, but I knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The thing that had been Ezra Whitmore was still out there, still connected to those houses through the residue it had left behind, still waiting for the right moment to continue its slow, methodical invasion of the warm, living spaces that had been built on its former territory. I served as sheriff for another 12 years before retiring, and every October I would make my rounds along Creek Road, checking on the houses that backed up to the water. Most years were quiet, with only the occasional report of strange smells or unusual sounds. But some years, the years when the autumn was particularly wet and cold, when the creek ran higher than usual, I would find fresh residue on porches and unexplained marks on windows. The families who lived in those houses learned to expect it, to clean up after it, to pretend that it was just another part of life in a small town where strange things happened and people minded their own business. But I could see it in their eyes, the knowledge that they were sharing their homes with something that had no right to exist, something that grew stronger and more persistent with each passing year. I moved away from Cedar Falls when I retired, bought a small house in a town where the only water was a municipal reservoir, and the newest building was older than any ghost. But I still get letters sometimes, from people who live along Bitter Creek, people who want to know if I remember the autumn when something started coming out of the water. I always write back, tell them I remember, tell them to keep their doors locked and their windows closed when October comes around. But I don't tell them the truth, that the thing in the creek isn't getting weaker with time, it's getting stronger. That the residue it leaves behind isn't just marking territory, it's changing the houses, making them more suitable for something that has no bones, no fixed form, no permanent shape. And I don't tell them about the dreams I still have, dreams where I'm standing in that cold water again, face to face with something that should have died 75 years ago, listening to it whisper about the warmth inside our houses and the life inside our bodies. Because some truths are too heavy for other people to carry, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. But if you ever find yourself in a small town where the houses back up to a creek, and if you wake up on an October morning to find translucent sheets draped over your porch furniture, remember this: it's not looking for a place to hide. It's looking for a place to live. And it's already decided that your house, your warm, living house, is exactly what it's been searching for. The wet slap of it dragging itself up your steps, that's just the sound of it coming home. Every night at 2:14, the static clears and she starts begging again. I've been sheriff of Millbrook County for 37 years, and I thought I'd seen everything this forsaken stretch of backwoods Massachusetts could throw at a man. Domestic disputes that ended with axes buried in kitchen tables. Hunters who came back from the deep woods speaking in tongues about things with too many eyes. Kids who wandered into the old Prescott place, and returned 3 days later with their hair gone white, and their minds somewhere else entirely. But nothing prepared me for the radio. It started in September of '89, when Old Dispatch finally died. The county board, in their infinite wisdom, decided we needed to upgrade from our 40-year-old system to something modern. What they bought us was a refurbished unit from the state police surplus, a Motorola from the early '70s that looked like it had been through a war. The thing squatted on my desk like a metal toad, all dials and switches that hummed with electric malevolence. During the day, it worked fine. Called out to the state boys, coordinated with the volunteer fire department, did everything it was supposed to do. But at night, when the sun disappeared behind the black wall of pine that surrounded our town like a noose, the radio developed its own personality. The first time I heard her, I was working late on paperwork. Budget reports and incident forms, the kind of mind-numbing bureaucracy that keeps small-town lawmen chained to their desks long after decent folks have gone to bed. The radio had been quiet for hours, just the occasional burst of static from distant stations bleeding through the atmospheric layers. Then, at exactly 2:14 a.m., the white noise cut out like someone had thrown a switch. "Help me!" came the voice, thin and desperate through the speaker. "Please, someone help me. He's coming back." I looked up from my papers, pen frozen in my hand. The voice was clear as daylight, clearer than any transmission I'd ever heard on that ancient equipment. A woman, young by the sound of her, maybe 20 or 25. Scared out of her mind. I grabbed the microphone. "This is Sheriff Harwick, Millbrook County. What's your location? Over." Static swallowed my words and spat them back as electronic gibberish. The woman's voice continued, oblivious to my response. "I can hear his boots on the porch. Oh God, he's got the rope again. Please, if anyone can hear this." The transmission died, replaced by the radio's familiar electric wheeze. I sat there for 10 minutes, waiting for her to come back, but heard nothing except the distant voice of a trucker on Route 9 complaining about a way station. I figured it was atmospheric skip, radio waves bouncing off the ionosphere and picking up transmissions from hundreds of miles away. Happens sometimes with the old equipment, especially on clear nights when the air's thin and the electromagnetic soup overhead gets stirred just right. Some poor woman in New York or Pennsylvania having the worst night of her life, and her call for help had somehow found its way to my radio. The next night, I made a point of staying late. Sure enough, at 2:14 on the dot, the static cleared. "He's in the kitchen now," she said, and her voice carried the peculiar clarity that comes with absolute terror. "I can see the light under the door. He's sharpening something." This time I was ready. I'd called the state police earlier, asked them to monitor all emergency frequencies at 2:14 a.m. I had dispatch records pulled, missing person reports, anything that might explain who this woman was and where she was calling from. But when I called the barracks the next morning, they told me they'd heard nothing. No emergency transmissions, no distress calls. Just normal radio traffic and the usual background noise. "You sure about the time, Sheriff?" asked Lieutenant Morrison, a good man who'd helped me out of more than one jam over the years. "Atmospheric conditions were pretty stable last night. Nothing that would cause skip propagation." I was sure about the time. I'd started keeping a log, writing down everything she said, word for word. The entries made for grim reading. September 15th, 2:14 a.m. "He's coming up the stairs. I can hear every board creak. Mama, if you're listening, I'm sorry I never came home." September 16th, 2:14 a.m. "The door won't hold much longer. He's got an axe now. Tell Danny I loved him. Tell him I tried to get away." September 17th, 2:14 a.m. "Please God, make it quick. Don't let him take his time like he did with the others. By the fourth night, I wasn't sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard her voice, thin and desperate, counting down to some horrible end. I started researching, diving into old case files and newspaper archives, looking for any trace of a woman who might match the voice on my radio. That's when I found the Hutchins file. Sarah Elizabeth Hutchins, age 23, reported missing on September 18, 1963. Last seen leaving her job at the Five and Dime in the center of town, walking home to the little rental house she shared with her boyfriend, Danny Morse. When Danny came home from his shift at the lumber mill, he found the front door standing open and Sarah's purse on the kitchen table, contents spilled across the linoleum like someone had been searching for something. The case file was thin, 3 pages of typewritten reports and a handful of witness statements that led nowhere. The sheriff back then was Tom Bradley, my predecessor's predecessor, a man I remembered as competent but unimaginative. He'd followed the usual leads, questioned the boyfriend, canvassed the neighbors, checked with relatives in neighboring towns. But Sarah Hutchins had simply vanished, as if the earth had opened up and swallowed her whole. The file was officially closed in 1964, marked Missing Person Cold Case. But there was something else, tucked behind the last page like an afterthought. A handwritten note in Bradley's careful script. Suspect may be local resident with history of violence against women. Similar disappearances in 1959, Margaret Doyle, and 1961, Patricia Santos. Recommend continued investigation pending new evidence. But there had been no continued investigation. Bradley retired in 1965, and his replacement had other priorities. The Hutchins case gathered dust in the filing cabinet for 24 years, forgotten by everyone except the woman whose voice now haunted my nights. I started digging deeper, going back through decades of old records and newspaper clippings. What I found made my blood run cold. Margaret Doyle, 19, disappeared walking home from a church social in July of 1959. Patricia Santos, 21, vanished from her apartment above Kowalski's grocery store in October of 1961. And there were others, going back even further. Women who disappeared without a trace, their cases closed and filed away, their names becoming footnotes in a story nobody wanted to read. The pattern was clear once you knew how to look for it. Every few years, always in September or October, always a young woman living alone or with a boyfriend who worked nights. Always the same modus operandi, no signs of struggle, no witnesses, no leads that went anywhere. Just an empty house and a life snuffed out like a candle in the wind. And now, 26 years after Sarah Hutchins had walked out of the Five and Dime for the last time, her voice was coming through my radio every night at 2:14 a.m., begging for help that would never come. I started staying at the office every night, logging each transmission, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The messages followed a pattern, repeating every few days but never exactly the same. Sometimes she talked about hiding in the closet, sometimes about running through the woods behind her house. Once she whispered about a man with scarred hands who smelled like motor oil and desperation. But it was the night of September 28th that everything changed. I was sitting at my desk, coffee gone cold hours ago, waiting for 2:14 to roll around. The radio crackled to life right on schedule, but instead of Sarah's terrified voice, I heard something else. Footsteps. Heavy boots on wooden boards, slow and deliberate. Then a man's voice, low and rough. "Where are you, sweetheart? I know you're in here somewhere." My hands went numb. In all the nights I'd been listening, I'd never heard anyone but Sarah. The man's voice was wrong somehow, like it was coming from underwater or through a long tunnel. But there was something familiar about it, something that tickled the back of my memory like a half-forgotten song. "Come on out, Sarah. Don't make this harder than it has to be." A door slammed somewhere in the transmission, followed by the sound of splintering wood. "Found you." Sarah's scream cut through the static like a knife, raw and primal and full of a terror so complete it seemed to leach through the radio's speaker and into the very air of my office. Then silence. Then static. I sat there for a long time after that, staring at the radio like it might bite me. The man's voice had stirred something in my memory, some fragment of a conversation or a name half heard. It took me 3 cups of coffee and most of the rest of the night, but finally it came to me. Ray Hutchins. Sarah's father. I drove out to the old Hutchins place the next morning, though I wasn't sure what I expected to find. The house had been abandoned for 20 years, ever since old Ray died of a heart attack in his kitchen. It sat at the end of a dirt track that wound through scrub pine and swamp maple, the kind of place where the sun never quite penetrated and the air always smelled of decay. The house was still standing, though just barely. Weather and neglect had stripped most of the paint from the clapboard siding, and the roof sagged like a broken back. Windows stared blindly from the facade like empty eye sockets, most of the glass long since broken by kids with rocks and too much time on their hands. I walked around the property, looking for I don't know what. Some sign, some clue that might explain why Sarah's voice was coming through a radio 2.5 decades after she'd disappeared. The yard was overgrown with sumac and wild grape, but you could still make out the foundations of old outbuildings. A barn, mostly collapsed. A chicken coop with its wire runs rusted through. And behind the house, set back in a stand of old-growth oak, the stone foundation of what might have been a root cellar. I probably would have walked right past it if not for the smell. It hit me when the wind shifted, a sweet sick odor that made my stomach clench. Not the smell of something recently dead, but something older, deeper. The smell of earth that had been disturbed and never properly settled. The smell of secrets buried but not deep enough. The root cellar was mostly collapsed, its wooden roof long since rotted away. But the stone walls were still solid, forming a rectangular pit about 8 feet by 12. At the bottom, half hidden by fallen leaves and debris, I could make out shapes that didn't belong. Pale curves that might have been stones, if you didn't look too close. If you didn't notice how they were arranged, how they fit together like pieces of a puzzle nobody wanted to solve. I called the state police from my car radio, told them I had a possible crime scene that needed processing. While I waited for them to arrive, I sat in my cruiser and tried not to think about what I'd found. Tried not to think about Ray Hutchins, who lived alone in that house for 40 years after his wife died. Tried not to think about the young women who disappeared over the decades, their cases closed and forgotten. But mostly, I tried not to think about the look I'd seen in Ray's eyes the few times our paths had crossed when I was a young deputy. The look of a man who enjoyed other people's fear, who fed on it like some kind of emotional parasite. The state forensics team arrived around noon, along with Lieutenant Morrison and a crew of technicians with cameras and evidence bags and the kind of grim expertise that comes from digging up too many secrets. They worked through the afternoon, carefully excavating the cellar, documenting and cataloging each find. By evening, they'd uncovered the remains of 7 women. 7 women, buried in a root cellar behind Ray Hutchins' house. 7 women whose disappearances had been written off as runaways or suicides or simple bad luck. 7 women whose names were Sarah Hutchins, Margaret Doyle, Patricia Santos, and 4 others whose identities would take weeks to confirm through dental records and forensic reconstruction. Looks like he kept them alive for a while, Morrison told me as we watched the coroner's team load the last of the remains into their van. The restraint marks on the bones, the positioning, this wasn't quick. He took his time with them. I nodded, though I wasn't really listening. I was thinking about the radio, About Sarah's voice coming through the static every night at 2:14. About the transmissions that had led me here, to this place where her bones had been waiting in the dark for 26 years. Hell of a thing, Morrison continued. Solving a case this old. What made you think to look here? I could have told him about the radio. Could have explained about the voice that came through the static. About the messages from a woman who'd been dead for more than 2 decades. But I knew how that would sound, and I knew Morrison well enough to know he'd have me evaluated for stress and probably forced into early retirement. So I lied. Found some old case files that pointed this way, I said. Just connected the dots. Morrison accepted this with a nod and went back to overseeing the scene processing. I stayed until the last technician packed up and left, until the root cellar was covered with yellow tape and the Hutchins property was secured as a crime scene. Then I drove back to town, to my office, to wait for 2:14 a.m. The radio stayed silent that night. And the next. And the night after that. I kept my vigil for 2 weeks, but Sarah's voice never came back. The static remained static. The night hours passed in normal silence, and gradually I began to think it was over. That whatever had tied her to that radio had been severed when we found her remains and gave her a proper burial. I was wrong. It was a Tuesday night in mid-October when I heard the first new voice. Same time, 2:14 a.m. exactly, but this time it wasn't Sarah speaking through the static. He promised me he'd let me go if I was good, the new voice said, young and frightened and full of a familiar desperation. But I can hear him digging outside. I think he's making my place. Margaret Doyle. It had to be. The second victim, the girl who disappeared in 1959. I grabbed my logbook and started writing, my hand shaking as I transcribed her words. This time, I was ready. This time, I understood what I was hearing. They all came, eventually. 7 voices from 7 different decades, speaking through the static at 2:14 a.m. Each one told her story, described her last hours, pleaded for help that had come 30 years too late. Sometimes they spoke to each other, their voices overlapping in conversations that spanned decades. Sometimes they spoke to me, though I could never be sure they knew I was listening. Patricia Santos talked about the man with scarred hands who smelled like motor oil and fear. Linda Morrison, no relation to the lieutenant, described being kept in a box under the house, fed scraps and promises that were always broken. Jennifer Walsh, the youngest at 17, sang lullabies in a voice that cracked with tears. And sometimes, late in the transmission when the voices were fading back into static, I heard him. Ray Hutchins, speaking from whatever hell had claimed him, still hunting, still promising, still lying to women who were beyond his reach now. I kept their stories, wrote down every word in a logbook that grew thick with testimony from the dead. I thought about going public, about telling someone what I'd found, but who would believe it? A sheriff claiming to receive radio transmissions from murder victims 30 years in the grave? They'd lock me up and throw away the key. So I kept their secrets, became the guardian of their voices, the only witness to their final testimonies. I listened every night for 3 years, until my retirement in 1992, when I passed the radio and the logbook to my successor with instructions that were carefully vague. Sometimes the old equipment picks up interference. I told Sheriff Brennan, a good man but young, unready for the truth. If you hear anything unusual, just log it. Don't try to respond. Just listen. He looked at me like I might be suffering from early onset dementia, but he nodded and promised to follow my instructions. I hope he kept that promise. I hope someone is still listening when the static clears at 2:14 a.m. Because they're still there, still speaking through the electronic void that separates the living from the dead. 7 voices from 7 graves, telling their stories to anyone who has the patience to listen and the courage to bear witness. I moved to Florida after retirement, bought a little place near the coast where the sun shines most days and the air doesn't carry the weight of old secrets. But sometimes, when I can't sleep and the night stretches too long before dawn, I tune my old portable radio to the frequency I memorized decades ago. And sometimes, if the atmospheric conditions are just right, if the distance between worlds grows thin enough, I hear them. Faint and far away, like voices calling across a vast dark ocean, but still there. Still telling their stories. Still begging for justice that came too late to save them but not too late to remember their names. Sarah Elizabeth Hutchins, Margaret N. Doyle, Patricia Maria Santos, Linda Sue Morrison, Jennifer Walsh, Karen Ostrowski, Amy Chin. 7 names, 7 voices. 7 women who deserve better than they got from this world, but who found a way to speak from the next one, to make sure their stories wouldn't be forgotten. Every night at 2:14, the static clears, and they start begging again. But now I know why. Now I understand that some stories demand to be told, even if the telling comes from beyond the grave. Some voices refuse to be silenced, even by death itself. In the old days, before forensic science and DNA analysis and all the modern tools we use to catch killers, monsters like Ray Hutchins could operate for decades without consequence. They could take what they wanted, bury their crimes in root cellars and shallow graves, and trust that time would erase their sins. But time doesn't erase everything. Some things echo, bounce back through the years like radio waves searching for a frequency, for someone willing to listen. I was that someone for Sarah Hutchins and the others. For 3 years I was their witness, their confessor, their connection to a world that had forgotten them. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was remembrance. And maybe, in the end, that's all any of us can ask for. To be remembered. To have our stories told. To know that somewhere, someone is listening when we call out in the dark. The radio is still there, I'm sure. Still sitting on the sheriff's desk in Millbrook County, humming with electronic malevolence. Still picking up voices that shouldn't exist, transmissions from a place where the dead don't rest easy. I hope whoever inherited that job from Sheriff Brennan has the sense to listen. I hope they keep the log, write down the words, bear witness to the testimonies that echo through the static. Because those voices matter. Those stories deserve to be heard. And because somewhere, in some other small town with its own dark secrets, another monster is taking what he wants from the innocent and trusting. Another Ray Hutchins is digging another grave, making promises he has no intention of keeping. But someday, years from now, when justice seems impossible and the case files gather dust, their voices will find a way through. They'll push through the static and the interference, through the barrier between worlds, and they'll tell their stories to anyone brave enough to listen. Every night at 2:14, the static clears. And somewhere, someone starts begging again. The circle never ends. The voices never stop. And in the deep woods of places like Millbrook County, where the trees grow thick and the shadows never quite lift, the radio keeps humming, waiting for the next transmission from the dark. Because the dead have stories to tell, and the static is their highway home. Every missing person leaves a mark up there. And last week, I found my own tooth swinging. 37 years I wore this badge in Millbrook County, and I've seen things that would make a grown man question his sanity. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I discovered in the deep woods behind the old carpenter place. Some stories you tell to other lawmen over whiskey and dim lights. Others you bury so deep you hope they'll rot before you do. This one's been eating at me for weeks now, and I figure it's time someone else knew about it, case something happens to me. The thing about small towns is they keep their secrets like old wounds, hidden under layers of normalcy but never quite healing. Millbrook's been hemorrhaging people for decades. Not in any dramatic way that would catch attention from the state boys or the feds. Just one here, one there. A drifter passing through who never made it to the next county. A teenager who told his folks he was heading to the city and never called home. Sometimes a local who just vanished. We'd file the reports, make the calls, search the usual places. Most times, folks would turn up weeks later in some other state, starting fresh. Sometimes they wouldn't. In a town of 800 souls, you learn to accept that people disappear. What choice do you have? But the tooth tree changed everything. Mrs. Carpenter first mentioned it 3 weeks ago, when she shuffled into my office clutching a thermos of coffee that smelled stronger than motor oil. 83 years old and sharp as winter wind, she'd outlived 2 husbands and raised 6 children on that property. If anyone knew the woods behind her house, it was her. "Sheriff, there's something wrong with that old oak," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk like she had all day. "Been wrong for longer than I care to admit, but it's getting worse." I'd known Mrs. Carpenter since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. She wasn't given to flights of fancy or attention-seeking dramatics. When she spoke, people listened. "What kind of wrong?" I asked, though part of me already dreaded the answer. "Teeth," she said simply. "Human teeth, hanging from the branches like some god-awful Christmas tree. Started years ago with just 1 or 2. Now there's dozens. Maybe more." The coffee in my mug suddenly tasted like ash. I set it down carefully, studying the old woman's weathered face for any sign of confusion or illness. Found nothing but steady conviction. "Mrs. Carpenter, when did you first notice these teeth?" She stared past me, out the window toward the treeline that bordered her property. "Hard to say exactly. Been avoiding that part of the woods for the better part of a decade. Something about it always felt hungry. But last week my cat got loose. Followed her trail right to that tree, and there it was. Strung up like a monument to something awful. I promised to look into it, thinking maybe kids were playing some elaborate prank or someone was trying to scare the old woman. But Mrs. Carpenter had been living in those woods since before I was born. She knew the difference between mischief and malevolence. That afternoon, I drove out to the Carpenter place. The house sat on 20 acres of mixed forest and overgrown pasture, the kind of land that's been in the same family for generations. Mrs. Carpenter met me on the porch, her arthritic hands wrapped around that same thermos. "Path starts behind the old chicken coop," she said. "Follow it about a quarter mile. You'll know when you find it." The woods were different from what I remembered as a boy. Darker somehow, even in the afternoon light. The trees grew close together, their branches intertwining overhead like arthritic fingers. Underfoot, the leaves were always damp, regardless of the weather. They made soft, wet sounds as I walked. The path Mrs. Carpenter mentioned was barely visible, more of a deer trail than anything humans had worn. But it led deeper into the woods with the kind of purposeful direction that suggested it had been used regularly, if not recently. Old blazes on the tree trunks confirmed it had once been a proper trail, though the marks were so weathered they could have been decades old. The silence was the first thing that struck me. Not the normal quiet of deep woods, where you can still hear birds and small animals going about their business. This was the kind of silence that makes your ears ring, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I found the tree exactly where Mrs. Carpenter said I would. It was massive, the kind of oak that takes centuries to grow, with a trunk so wide it would take 4 men holding hands to circle it. But the tree was dead. Had been for years, judging by the gray, lifeless bark and the way its branches reached toward the sky like the arms of a drowning man. And hanging from those branches, swaying gently in a breeze I couldn't feel, were teeth. Dozens of them. Human teeth of every variety, molars, incisors, canines, suspended on what looked like fishing line or thin wire. Some were old, yellowed with age and wear. Others looked almost fresh, still white with traces of pink at the roots. They clicked together softly as they moved, creating a sound like wind chimes made of bone. I stood there for a long time, trying to process what I was seeing. Trying to come up with rational explanations. Maybe it was some kind of art installation. Maybe someone had been collecting teeth from dental offices and decided to make some twisted sculpture. But the longer I stared, the more I noticed details that made my skin crawl. The teeth weren't random. They were organized. Arranged in clusters that seemed to correspond to individual mouths. A full set of adult teeth here, a child's baby teeth there. Some clusters were incomplete, as if waiting for the rest to arrive. I pulled out my phone to take pictures, but the camera wouldn't focus properly. Every shot came out blurred, as if something was interfering with the technology. The phone's battery, which had been full when I left the office, was down to 20%. That's when I noticed the smell. It wasn't decay exactly, though there was something organic and wrong about it. It was more like the smell of old blood mixed with something sweet and cloying. The kind of smell that gets into your nose and stays there, following you home like an unwanted memory. I circled the tree, counting the clusters of teeth. 37 distinct groups, if my count was right. Each one representing a complete human mouth. The implications of that number made my hands shake as I wrote in my notebook. Near the base of the tree, the ground was different. Softer. Darker. When I knelt down and pushed aside the layer of decomposing leaves, I found soil that was rich and black, like the kind you'd find in a well-tended garden. But there was something else mixed in, small white fragments that looked suspiciously like bone meal. I was so focused on the ground that I almost missed the carving in the tree trunk. Someone had gouged crude symbols into the dead bark, arranged in a rough circle about 6 feet from the base. They didn't look like any writing I recognized, more like the kind of marks you might find in old caves or forgotten places where people once gathered for purposes lost to time. The sun was getting low by the time I finished my initial examination. I'd filled half a notebook with observations and taken several soil samples, though I wasn't sure what I'd tell the lab about where they came from. As I prepared to leave, I took one last look at the hanging teeth. That's when I saw it. Mixed in with the others, near the center of the tree, was a tooth I recognized. A left lateral incisor with a distinctive chip on one corner, the result of a childhood accident involving a baseball and my brother's inability to catch. I'd lived with that chipped tooth for 43 years until a root canal went bad and my dentist pulled it 6 months ago. My tooth was hanging from that tree, swaying gently with the others. The walk back to Mrs. Carpenter's house felt longer than it should have. The forest seemed to press in from all sides, and I kept hearing sounds that weren't quite sounds, footsteps that stopped when I stopped, whispers that might have been wind through dead leaves. By the time I reached the car, my shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool evening air. Mrs. Carpenter was waiting on the porch, as if she'd known exactly when I'd return. "You saw it," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "How many?" she asked. 37 sets. Maybe more." She was quiet for a long moment, staring off toward the tree line. "That's about right. Been 37 people gone missing from this county in the last 40 years. Give or take." I stared at her. "You've been keeping count?" "Someone has to. Police reports get filed and forgotten. Families move away or die off. But the woods remember. The woods always remember." She invited me inside for coffee, but I declined. I needed to get back to the office, needed to start making calls and checking records. But as I drove away, Mrs. Carpenter's words echoed in my mind. 37 people. 37 sets of teeth. The next few days were a blur of research and growing dread. I pulled every missing person report from the county files going back 50 years. Cross-referenced them with state databases and FBI records. The pattern that emerged made my blood run cold. They hadn't all disappeared at once. The intervals were irregular, sometimes years apart, sometimes months. But they were all connected by geography. Every missing person had last been seen within a 10-mile radius of the Carpenter property. And none of them had ever been found. More disturbing was what I discovered about the property itself. The land had changed hands frequently over the centuries, but always under strange circumstances. Families would live there for a generation or two, then suddenly abandon the place, leaving behind their belongings and never returning. The Carpenters had owned it longer than anyone in recorded history, but even they had stories. I visited Mrs. Carpenter again, bringing copies of missing person reports and historical records. She served coffee and store-bought cookies while I spread the papers across her kitchen table. "Your family's been here since the 1920s, I said. "What do you know about the previous owners?" She adjusted her glasses and peered at the documents. "The Hutchins family built the original homestead. They were strange people. Kept to themselves mostly. Then one winter they just vanished. All of them. Left everything behind, furniture, livestock, even money hidden in the walls. What year was this? 1881, according to my grandfather. He was the one who found the place empty. Said the animals had all died of starvation, locked in their stalls. But the strange thing was, there were no tracks leading away from the house. No sign of where the family had gone." I made notes while she talked, but part of my mind was elsewhere, trying to piece together a timeline that made sense. "Did your family ever experience anything unusual while living here?" Mrs. Carpenter was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. Then she got up and walked to the window that faced the woods. "We lost 3 people over the years," she said finally. "My youngest brother in 1943. My eldest son in 1967. My second husband in 1989. All of them wandered into those woods and never came back." The way she said it, matter of fact, without emotion, sent chills down my spine. "You never reported them missing? What would have been the point?" "The woods took them. Same as they've taken all the others. You can't fight something like that with paperwork and search parties." That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those teeth swaying in the breeze, heard the soft clicking sound they made as they touched. And at the center of it all, my own tooth, the physical proof that whatever was happening in those woods had already claimed a piece of me. I spent the next week researching everything I could find about the history of Millbrook County. What I discovered painted a picture of a place that had always been touched by something dark and inexplicable. The Native American tribes that once inhabited the area had legends about the deep woods. Stories of a hungry spirit that demanded tribute in exchange for allowing people to live on the land. Early settlers wrote letters to relatives back east describing strange phenomena. Animals found drained of blood, people who wandered into the forest and returned days later with no memory of where they'd been, trees that grew in impossible formations. But the most disturbing discovery came from the county coroner's office. I'd known old Doc Henley since he took over the position in the 1970s, and he had a reputation for meticulous record-keeping. When I asked him about unusual deaths or unexplained findings, he invited me to his basement office where he kept the older files. "Funny you should ask," he said, pulling a thick folder from a metal cabinet. "Been meaning to talk to someone about this for years, but never knew who to trust." The folder contained autopsy reports and photographs dating back decades. All of them showed the same impossible detail. Bodies found in the woods with all their teeth missing, extracted with surgical precision. No other injuries. No signs of struggle. Just empty sockets where teeth should have been. How many? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. 37, over the past 40 years. All found within a few miles of the old Carpenter place. And Sheriff. He paused, studying my face in the dim light of the basement office. Every one of them died of natural causes. Heart failure, mostly. As if they just gave up. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture I didn't want to see. But I couldn't stop now. I had to know the truth, even if it destroyed everything I thought I understood about the world. I returned to the woods the next evening, armed with a better camera and a portable spotlight. The tooth tree looked exactly as I'd left it, but something had changed. There were more teeth now. Fresh ones, still pink at the roots. And the smell was stronger, more oppressive. I set up my equipment and began documenting everything systematically. Close-up shots of individual teeth, wide shots showing the entire tree, measurements and sketches of the carved symbols. The camera worked perfectly this time, as if whatever force had interfered before was now allowing me to record what I found. It was while examining the newest additions that I made the most disturbing discovery of all. Among the fresh teeth, I found a wisdom tooth with a distinctive gold crown. I recognized it immediately. It belonged to Tommy Breslin, the state highway worker who disappeared 2 weeks ago while surveying roads in the area. His body had been found 3 days later, deep in the woods, apparently dead of a heart attack. The coroner's report had mentioned missing teeth, but I hadn't made the connection until now. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Whatever was happening here wasn't just about missing people. It was about all of them, everyone who died in these woods, missing or not. Something was collecting their teeth, adding them to this grotesque monument. But why? And what did it want with mine? I was so focused on the tooth tree that I almost missed the sound of footsteps behind me. When I turned, expecting to see Mrs. Carpenter or perhaps another curious local, I found nothing but empty forest. But the footsteps continued, circling me at a distance I couldn't quite pinpoint. The spotlight beams swept across the trees, revealing nothing but shadows and dead leaves. But the sounds were getting closer, and they were coming from multiple directions now. Not the random movements of animals, but the deliberate, coordinated approach of hunters closing in on prey. That's when I saw them. They emerged from the darkness like memories given form, translucent figures that seemed to flicker between solid and shadow. I recognized some of them from the missing person files. Others were faces I'd seen in old photographs or family albums. All of them were missing their teeth, their mouths gaping black holes in faces that couldn't quite hold their shape. They moved toward the tree with a purpose that seemed both ancient and inevitable. As they drew closer, I could see that each one carried something in their hands, small white objects that caught the light. More teeth. Fresh ones. The figures began to hang their offerings on the lower branches, adding to the collection with a reverence that spoke of ritual and worship. They moved silently, but I could hear something else now, a low humming that seemed to come from the tree itself, growing stronger as each new tooth was added. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get as far away from that place as possible. But I couldn't move. The humming was getting inside my head, making my thoughts sluggish and strange. I found myself stepping closer to the tree, drawn by something I couldn't name or resist. One of the figures turned toward me, a young woman I recognized from a missing person report from 1987. Her eyes were hollow sockets, but somehow she still managed to look directly at me. When she opened her mouth to speak, no sound came out, but I understood her message anyway. The tree was hungry. It had always been hungry, and it would continue to feed until it had what it needed. But what did it need? What was the purpose of this collection, this monument of human remains? The answer came to me with a clarity that felt like madness. The tree wasn't just collecting teeth, it was collecting people. Every tooth represented a life, a soul, a piece of human consciousness trapped in dead wood and hanging metal. And it wanted me to join them. The humming grew louder, more insistent. I felt my feet moving forward without conscious command, carrying me toward the base of the tree where the soft, dark soil waited. Part of me, a growing part, wanted to surrender to it, to become part of whatever ancient purpose this place served. But another part of me, the part that had worn a badge for 37 years and seen enough evil to recognize it when it stared me in the face, fought back. I forced myself to turn away from the tree, to break eye contact with the hollow-eyed figures that surrounded me. The walk back to my car was the longest of my life. Every step felt like swimming through molasses, and the humming followed me all the way to the edge of the property. But I made it. I got in the car, started the engine, and drove away from that cursed place. But I didn't go home. Instead, I drove to the county courthouse, where I spent the rest of the night in the basement records room, looking for any clue that might explain what I'd witnessed. What I found was a land deed from 1823, written in fading ink on yellowed paper. The original grant described the property as cursed ground unsuitable for Christian habitation. It went on to detail the terms of sale. The land could be owned and inhabited, but only at a price. One life for every generation. One soul to feed whatever slept beneath the roots of the great oak. The deed was signed by a territorial governor I'd never heard of, but the signature at the bottom belonged to someone I recognized. The first carpenter to own the property, Mrs. Carpenter's great-great-grandfather. I confronted her the next morning, finding her on the porch with her eternal thermos of coffee. She didn't seem surprised to see me. "You went back," she said. I nodded, settling into the chair beside her. "I know about the deed. About the price your family's been paying." She was quiet for a long moment, staring off toward the woods. "Every generation we lose someone. It's the way it's always been. The way it has to be. But why? What's the point of feeding that thing?" "Balance," she said simply. "The tree keeps the hungry thing dormant. As long as it gets what it needs, it stays in those woods. If it ever got truly hungry..." She shuddered. "Well, 37 people over 40 years would seem like a mercy." The implications of what she was saying hit me like a sledgehammer. The tooth tree wasn't the monster, it was a prison. A feeding station designed to keep something much worse contained. "What happens when your family dies out?" I asked. "When there's no one left to maintain the arrangement?" Mrs. Carpenter turned to look at me with eyes that seemed far older than her 83 years. "That's why you found your tooth up there, Sheriff. The tree's been watching you. Choosing you. When I'm gone, someone else will have to take over." I stood up so fast the chair nearly toppled over. "You're insane. This whole thing is insane." "Is it?" she asked calmly. "You've seen the evidence. You know what's waiting in those woods. You can walk away, pretend none of this ever happened. But how long before people start disappearing in larger numbers? How long before whatever's sleeping under that tree decides it's had enough patience?" I didn't have an answer for that. All I knew was that I couldn't be part of whatever sick tradition the Carpenter family had been maintaining for generations. But as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that the choice had already been made for me. My tooth was hanging from that tree for a reason. I was connected to that place now, whether I wanted to be or not. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I've tried to put the whole thing out of my mind. I've gone back to my normal routine, processing paperwork, responding to calls, pretending that the world still makes sense. But every night, I dream about the tree. I dream about the figures in the woods, their hollow eyes and gaping mouths. And every morning, I wake up with the taste of grave dirt in my mouth and the sound of clicking teeth in my ears. Mrs. Carpenter died in her sleep 4 days ago. Natural causes, according to Doc Henley. But I know better. I know she was the last of her line, the last guardian of a secret that should have died with her. The funeral was yesterday. As I stood beside her grave, I could see the woods in the distance, dark and patient. Waiting. Last night, I went back to the tree one final time. The collection had grown again, new teeth hanging from the branches like obscene fruit. But something else had changed too. The carved symbols on the trunk were glowing with a faint phosphorescent light, and the humming had become a song. It was calling my name. I know what I have to do. Mrs. Carpenter was right. Someone has to maintain the balance. Someone has to keep the hungry thing fed and sleeping. And for reasons I don't fully understand, that someone is me. I'm recording this confession on my phone, leaving it where someone will eventually find it. Maybe you'll think I was crazy, an old man who finally snapped under the pressure of too many years in a job that shows you the worst of humanity. Maybe you'll file it away and forget about it. But if people start disappearing in larger numbers, if the normal pattern of loss and sorrow that defines small-town life suddenly accelerates into something more sinister, remember what I've told you. Remember the tooth tree and the price of keeping ancient hungers satisfied. I can see it now through my bedroom window, the dark outline of the woods, the phosphorescent glow of the symbols. The tree is calling, and I can't resist anymore. I don't want to resist. By the time you hear this, I'll be hanging from those branches. Not my body, that will probably be found miles away, another unexplained death in the county records. But my essence, my soul, whatever makes me who I am, that will be part of the collection now. Part of the monument to necessity and sacrifice. And when the next guardian is chosen, when the tree selects someone else to carry on the tradition, I'll be there to guide them. To explain what needs to be done, and why it matters. The woods are never silent, you see. They're always whispering, always watching, always hungry. And someone has to feed them. The humming is getting louder now. It's time to go. Sheriff William Bill Mackenzie. Millbrook County Sheriff's Department. Badge number 237. End of recording. Found on the body of Sheriff William Mackenzie, discovered in the woods behind the former Carpenter property on, date redacted. Subject appeared to have died of natural causes. Dental records indicate all teeth had been surgically removed post-mortem. Investigation ongoing. Detective Sarah Chin, State Police. Case file #redacted. No matter how many times we search it, the air in that place stays thick with rot. I've been sheriff of Millbrook County for 37 years now, and I can tell you that every town has its wounds. Some heal over time, others fester. The Hartwell House is our festering wound, and it's been weeping poison into this community since before I pinned on my first badge. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in late September. Not the kind of call that gets your blood pumping, just Mrs. Henley from down on Maple Street, complaining about the smell again. She'd made the same complaint 14 times in the past 2 years, always the same words. That stench from the old Hartwell place is getting worse, Sheriff. Something's got to be done. The Hartwell house sits at the dead end of Sycamore Lane, where the pavement gives way to weeds and the mailboxes stop. It's a 2-story colonial that might have been white once, though the clapboard siding has gone gray as old bones. The front porch sags like a broken smile, and the windows stare out at nothing with the dull sheen of cataracts. Nobody's lived there for 8 years. Harold Hartwell died in his sleep upstairs in the master bedroom, and his nephew from Portland came down to settle the estate. Took one look at the place, one whiff of whatever hangs in the air there, and put it on the market as is. It's been for sale ever since, though the realtor stopped showing it after the third family walked out gagging. That Tuesday morning, I drove out to Sycamore Lane just like I had 13 times before. The autumn air was crisp and clean until I got within 100 yards of the house. Then it hit me, that smell. Sweet and cloying at first, like overripe fruit, but underneath it's something else. Something that made your sinuses burn and your stomach clench. I parked in the cracked driveway and sat there for a moment, windows rolled up, breathing through my mouth. The smell seemed to seep through the glass anyway, coating the back of my throat like syrup. I'd been through this routine before, walked the perimeter, checked the doors and windows, peer into the basement. Never found so much as a dead raccoon. The front door was locked, same as always. I had a key, part of the arrangement with the nephew, who'd long since stopped returning calls about the property. The lock turned easy enough, but the door stuck in its frame like it was held by something more than just warped wood. When it finally gave way, the smell hit me like a physical thing. I've seen my share of death. Car accidents, hunting mishaps, old folks who died alone and weren't found for weeks. I know what decay smells like. This was decay, but wrong somehow. Too fresh, too present, as if something had just died in their moments before I arrived. The interior was just as I remembered, dust sheets over furniture, family photographs still hanging on the walls, Harold's reading glasses sitting on the mantel where he'd left them years ago. Everything looked exactly the same as my last visit, but the smell was stronger. Much stronger. I made my usual circuit through the downstairs rooms, breathing through my mouth, looking for anything that might explain the stench. The kitchen was clean, the garbage disposal empty. The basement was dry, no signs of flooding or mold. I checked every closet, every corner, even looked inside the old icebox in the pantry. Nothing. Upstairs was where Harold had died, but the bedroom was just as empty as the rest of the house. The mattress had been stripped and hauled away by the nephew, leaving only a rusty bed frame and a water stain on the hardwood floor where the old man had breathed his last. I stood in that bedroom for longer than I should have, trying to locate the source of the smell. It seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, as if it was rising from the walls themselves. The air was thick with it, thick enough that I could almost taste it on my tongue, sweet corruption, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. When I finally gave up and headed back downstairs, I noticed something I'd missed on the way up. There was a photograph hanging in the stairwell, one of those old family portraits from the 50s or 60s. Harold as a young man, standing beside a woman I assumed was his wife, and between them a little girl with dark hair and serious eyes. I'd seen the photograph before, of course, but something about it caught my attention. The glass was clean, too clean. Everything else in the house was coated with dust, but the glass over this photograph was spotless, as if someone had been polishing it regularly. I looked closer and felt something cold settle in my stomach. The little girl's eyes seemed to follow me as I moved, and her mouth, had it always been turned down in that expression of profound sadness? I couldn't remember. I left the house that day with more questions than answers, and the smell seemed to cling to my uniform for hours afterward. My wife made me change clothes in the garage before I came inside, said I reeked like a slaughterhouse. The next call came 3 days later. This time it was Tom Brewster, whose property backs up to the Hartwell lot. He was worked up, more so than usual. "Sheriff, something's got to be done about that house," he said, voice tight with frustration. "The smell's gotten so bad my dogs won't even go in the backyard." They just whine and scratch at the door like they're scared of something. I drove out there again, this time bringing along Deputy Morrison, who just joined the force after 4 years in the military. Morrison was young, eager, and hadn't yet learned that some things in this job don't have easy explanations. The smell hit us both the moment we got out of the cruiser. Morrison actually took a step back, his hand going to his mouth. Jesus, Sheriff. What died in there? That's what we're here to find out. This time I was more thorough. We went through every room with a fine-tooth comb, moved furniture, checked behind appliances that had been left behind. Morrison brought a flashlight with him, and we examined every corner of the basement, looking for dead animals, broken sewer lines, anything that might explain the stench. We found nothing. Again. But Morrison noticed something I had missed. In the kitchen, there was a small table pushed against the wall, the kind old people use for their morning coffee and newspaper. On it sat a ceramic sugar bowl with a matching creamer, both covered in dust like everything else. Except for the sugar bowl's lid, which was sitting slightly askew. Morrison lifted the lid and immediately dropped it. The ceramic shattered on the linoleum floor, and the smell, God, the smell that rose from that bowl was like nothing I'd ever encountered. Pure, concentrated decay, so powerful it made my eyes water. But the bowl was empty. Completely empty, not even a grain of sugar at the bottom. We left the house that day with the broken ceramics still scattered on the kitchen floor, and I found myself thinking about that photograph in the stairwell. The little girl with the sad eyes and the spotless glass. That night, I did something I rarely do. I went to the library and looked up the Hartwell family in the old newspaper archives. What I found made me wish I'd left well enough alone. Harold Hartwell had been married to a woman named Margaret, and they'd had a daughter, Sarah. In 1962, when Sarah was 7 years old, she disappeared from their backyard while playing on a summer afternoon. The search had gone on for weeks, involved half the county and volunteers from 3 neighboring towns. They dragged ponds, searched the woods, followed up on every lead no matter how far-fetched. They never found her. The marriage hadn't survived the loss. Margaret moved away within a year, and Harold lived alone in that house for the next 46 years, until the day he died in his sleep upstairs in the master bedroom. I closed the newspaper archives and sat in the library's reading room until they turned the lights off around me. Outside, Millbrook was settling into its evening routine, families gathering for dinner, children called in from play, the ordinary business of ordinary lives. But I couldn't shake the image of that photograph, the little girl with the sad eyes watching me from behind spotless glass. The calls started coming in more frequently after that. First Mrs. Henley, then Tom Brewster, then the Kowalskis who lived across the street. The smell was getting worse, they said. It was seeping into their own homes now, clinging to their clothes, their hair, their children. I started visiting the house weekly, then twice a week. Each time the smell was stronger, more pervasive. Each time I found nothing to explain it. The house was empty, had been empty for 8 years, but something was wrong with it. Something was growing in there, feeding on itself, getting stronger. Morrison came with me on most of these visits, but I could see it was getting to him. He'd taken to breathing through a handkerchief soaked in menthol, and even then he'd go pale within minutes of entering the house. After the 4th visit, he started making excuses to stay in the car. "I don't know how you stand it in there, Sheriff," he said one afternoon, watching me emerge from the front door. "It's like the smell is alive." He wasn't wrong. The smell did seem alive, seemed to pulse and breathe and grow stronger with each passing day. And there was something else. Something I didn't tell Morrison or anyone else. When I was inside that house, I felt watched. Not by neighbors peering through windows or curious passers-by, but by something inside the house itself. Something that moved just at the edge of my vision, always disappearing when I turned to look directly at it. The photograph in the stairwell bothered me more each visit. The glass stayed clean while everything else accumulated dust, and I swear the little girl's expression was changing. The sadness in her eyes was deepening, and sometimes, though I told myself it was just a trick of the light, her mouth seemed to be moving, as if she were trying to tell me something. I started bringing a camera with me, taking pictures of the photograph from different angles, comparing them when I got back to the station. The differences were subtle but undeniable. In one photo, the girl's hand was resting at her side. In another, taken a week later, it was raised slightly, as if she were reaching for something. Her eyes, which had stared straight ahead in the first picture, seemed to be looking down by the third visit, down toward the first floor of the house. I followed her gaze and found myself staring at the kitchen, where we'd broken the sugar bowl, where the ceramic pieces still lay scattered on the linoleum because I couldn't bring myself to go back in there and clean them up. The breaking point came in November, when the smell reached the elementary school 3 blocks away. The principal called me personally, said the children were complaining of headaches and nausea, that some of the teachers were having trouble breathing. The school nurse was sending kids home early, and parents were starting to ask questions. I knew I had to do something more than just another walkthrough. I called the county health department, environmental services, even a team from the state university that specialized in air quality testing. They came out with their equipment, and their clipboards and their professional skepticism. The readings they got defied explanation. The air inside the house showed elevated levels of hydrogen sulfide, methane, and several other compounds associated with decomposition. But the levels were impossible, higher than what you'd find in an active landfill, concentrated enough to be dangerous to human health. But there was nothing decomposing in that house. Nothing at all. "Sheriff," the lead technician told me as they packed up their equipment, "I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen readings like these. The air in there is toxic, but we can't find a source. It's like the smell is being generated by the house itself." They recommended the house be condemned and demolished immediately. I agreed, started the paperwork that same day. But something happened that I should have expected, something that tells you everything you need to know about the Hartwell house. The demolition crew quit after 2 hours. 3 grown men, professionals who'd torn down everything from crack houses to factory buildings, walked off the job because of the smell. They said they couldn't work in those conditions, that the air inside the house was making them sick, making them see things that weren't there. Making them see things. I never got details on what they saw, because they wouldn't talk about it. Just packed up their equipment and left, and no amount of money could convince them to come back. I tried 2 more demolition companies. Same result. Word got around, and soon nobody in the county would touch the job. The Hartwell house was going to stay right where it was, rotting from the inside out, poisoning the air for blocks around. That's when I started going to the house at night. I told myself it was official business, that I needed to monitor the situation, document any changes. But the truth was darker than that. The truth was that the house was calling to me, drawing me back again and again like a wound you can't stop picking at. The smell was different at night. Still present, still overwhelming, but somehow more focused. It led me through the house like a trail of breadcrumbs, from room to room, always ending at the stairwell where the photograph hung in its frame of spotless glass. The little girl, Sarah, was definitely changing now. Her hand was reaching down toward the first floor. Her mouth was open as if she were calling out, and her eyes had filled with tears that seemed to glisten in the beam of my flashlight. She was trying to tell me something, trying to show me something, but I was too old and too stubborn to understand. It was Morrison who finally figured it out. He'd been avoiding the house for weeks, but the smell had gotten so bad that it was affecting the whole neighborhood. People were staying indoors, keeping their windows closed even on mild days. Property values were plummeting, and the mayor was breathing down my neck to find a solution. Morrison came with me on a Friday night in late November, fortified with menthol and determination. We went through the house one more time, room by room, and when we reached the stairwell he stopped dead in his tracks. "Sheriff," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Look at the girl in the picture." I looked. Sarah Hartwell gazed down at us with her sad eyes and open mouth, her hand reaching toward the first floor, tears streaming down her cheeks in the photograph that should have been static, unchanging. "She's pointing," Morrison said. "Look where she's pointing." I followed his gaze, followed Sarah's reaching hand, and saw what I should have seen weeks ago. The hardwood floor at the base of the stairs was different from the rest of the house. Newer. The boards were a slightly different color, installed sometime after the original construction. Morrison knelt and ran his hands over the floor, feeling for loose boards, irregularities, anything that might explain the variance in the wood. When his fingers found the edges of a section that gave slightly under pressure, we both knew what we were going to find underneath. We went back to the station for crowbars and shovels, and by the time we returned, the smell in the house had grown so strong it was like walking into a wall of poison. But we pressed on, driven by the knowledge that we were finally going to get answers. The floorboards came up easily, too easily, as if they'd been removed and replaced many times over the years. Underneath was dirt, loose, dark soil that didn't match the clay foundation of the rest of the house. We dug carefully, respectfully, knowing what we were going to find but hoping we were wrong. 3 feet down, Morrison's shovel struck something that wasn't earth. Something small and white and heartbreakingly familiar. The bones of a 7-year-old girl, still wearing the remains of a summer dress from 1962. Sarah Hartwell had been in that house all along, buried beneath the floorboards while her father lived above her for 46 years, while search parties scoured the county, while her mother moved away in grief. She'd been there, waiting, growing stronger in death, filling the air with the smell of injustice and neglect and a child's desperate need to be found. We called the state police, the coroner, all the officials who needed to be involved in a case like this. They came and did their jobs, documented everything, treated Sarah's remains with the dignity she deserved. The house was finally scheduled for demolition, this time by a crew from out of state who didn't know the history and couldn't back out of their contract. But before they tore it down, I went back one last time. The smell was gone. Completely gone, as if it had never been there at all. The air inside the house was stale and dusty, but clean. Normal. The photograph in the stairwell showed a family of 3, Harold, Margaret, and their daughter Sarah, all smiling at the camera in a moment of happiness from before the world went dark. Sarah's eyes looked straight ahead now, no longer sad, no longer reaching. She looked at peace. I like to think she found what she was looking for, not just discovery, but justice. Harold Hartwell had died in his sleep, taking his secrets with him, but the truth has a way of surfacing eventually. The investigation that followed Sarah's discovery revealed that Harold had been the prime suspect all along, though there'd never been enough evidence to charge him. Neighbors remembered him as a stern man, too quick to anger, especially after he'd been drinking. The house was demolished in the spring, and the lot was turned into a small memorial garden. The city planted flowers there, put up a bench with a plaque that reads, "In memory of Sarah Hartwell, beloved daughter." Children play there now, their laughter bright in the air where the smell of death once lingered. But I still drive by sometimes, especially on summer evenings when the light is soft and the flowers are blooming. I sit in my cruiser and watch the children play, and I think about Sarah, about the 8 years she spent trying to tell us she was there, trying to lead us to the truth. And sometimes, when the wind is just right and the evening light hits the memorial garden at the perfect angle, I swear I can see her there among the playing children. A little girl with dark hair and serious eyes, no longer sad, no longer reaching for something just beyond her grasp. She's found what she was looking for. She's finally been found. No matter how many times we searched it, the air in that place stayed thick with rot, until we listened to what it was trying to tell us. Until we understood that some smells aren't just decay, but the accumulated weight of untold stories, unspoken truths, and the desperate need of the dead to be remembered. That's what I've learned in 37 years of wearing this badge. The dead don't rest easy when they've been forgotten. They linger in the spaces between what we know and what we refuse to see, growing stronger with each passing day, until finally someone with eyes to see and ears to hear pays attention to what they're trying to say. Sarah Hartwell is at peace now, but there are other houses in this county, other places where the air hangs heavy with secrets. Other stories waiting to be told, other truths demanding to be acknowledged. I'm getting old, but I'm not done listening yet. Because somebody has to hear what the dead are trying to tell us. Somebody has to pay attention when the air itself becomes a voice, calling out from the darkness, demanding justice, demanding remembrance, demanding to be found. When the sky blackens without clouds, you know he's near. That's what old Martha Henley used to say, sitting on her porch with that glass of sweet tea sweating in the August heat, watching the sky like it owed her money. I never paid much mind to Martha's sayings back then. Lord knows she had plenty of them, most involving signs and portents, and the devil's handiwork. But that was before the summer of '97, before the thing that walked like a man but wasn't one started leaving its calling cards all over Millbrook County. I've been sheriff here for 37 years now, and I've seen my share of the strange and unsettling. Small towns breed their own particular brand of darkness, you understand. It settles in the spaces between houses, grows in the shadows of old barns, feeds on the secrets people keep buried in their backyards along with their dead pets and forgotten dreams. But what happened that summer? Well, that was something else entirely. It started with the Garrison boy finding those feathers. Tommy Garrison was maybe 8 at the time, all freckles and gap teeth, and that particular brand of fearlessness that comes before the world teaches you better. He'd been playing in the creek that runs behind the old Whitmore place. You know the one, been empty since '78, when Charles Whitmore put a shotgun in his mouth rather than face another winter alone. The boy came running into town around noon, clutching a handful of black feathers like they were made of gold. "Sheriff! Sheriff!" he hollered, bursting through my office door without so much as a how do you do. "I found something weird." Now, 8-year-old boys find weird things every day of the week and twice on Sunday. Usually it's a dead possum or a rusty hubcap or something their imagination has transformed into treasure. But these feathers. I took one look at them and felt something cold settle in my belly. They were crow feathers, no doubt about that. But they were wrong somehow. Too big, for one thing, each one nearly the length of my hand. And they had this oily sheen to them, like they'd been dipped in something that wasn't quite water and wasn't quite blood. When I held them up to the light, they seemed to absorb it rather than reflect it, creating these little pockets of darkness that made my eyes water. "Where exactly did you find these, son?" "Down by the creek, behind the Whitmore place. There was this big circle of them, just laying on the ground. And Sheriff," he leaned in close, lowering his voice to that stage whisper children use when they're telling you something important. "There was something else. Something red in the middle. I should have gone down there right away. Should have loaded up my patrol car and driven out to see what Tommy was talking about. Instead, I filed it away in that mental compartment where sheriffs keep the things that don't quite make sense but probably have perfectly reasonable explanations. Kids see things differently than adults. Their imaginations turn shadows into monsters, puddles into lakes, scattered garbage into mysterious circles. But that night, I couldn't stop thinking about those feathers. The next morning brought Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald to my door, wringing her hands and speaking in that breathless way people do when they're trying to convince themselves they haven't seen what they've seen. "Sheriff Barnes, I need to report well, I'm not sure what to call it. A disturbance, I suppose?" Eleanor ran the flower shop on Main Street, had been doing it for near on 20 years. Practical woman, not given to flights of fancy or hysterics. If Eleanor Fitzgerald said she'd seen a disturbance, then something had definitely been disturbed. "What kind of disturbance, Mrs. Fitzgerald?" "It was around 3 in the morning. I was up, couldn't sleep, you know how it is, and I heard this sound outside. Like wings. Hundreds of wings, all beating at once. So I looked out my bedroom window, and there was this thing standing in my flower garden." She paused, wrapping her sweater tighter around her shoulders despite the morning heat. "It was shaped like a man, Sheriff, but it wasn't. It was made of birds. Crows. All black and shifting and wrong. It just stood there for maybe a minute, not moving, and then it sort of fell apart. The birds scattered in every direction. But Sheriff, when I went out this morning to check on my garden—" "What did you find, Eleanor?" "Every flower was dead. Not wilted, not diseased. Dead. Black as coal and crumbling to ash when I touched them. And there were feathers everywhere. Hundreds of them." I drove out to Eleanor's place after she left, though I wasn't sure what I expected to find. The garden was exactly as she described. A perfect circle of devastation in what had been a riot of summer blooms just the day before. The flowers hadn't just died, they'd been drained of something essential, leaving behind brittle husks that crumbled at the slightest touch. And the feathers. Christ, the feathers were everywhere. I collected a few, noting they were the same impossible size and oily texture as the ones Tommy had found. But there was something else now. Something I hadn't noticed before. They smelled wrong. Not the clean, wild smell you'd expect from bird feathers, but something rank and copper-sweet. Like old blood mixed with something that had been dead too long. The third incident happened that same afternoon. I was driving patrol along County Road 47 when I saw Bill Morrison's pickup truck pulled over on the shoulder, emergency flashers blinking. Bill stood beside the truck, staring up at the telephone wires that ran parallel to the road. Even from a distance, I could see his face had gone the color of old milk. "Afternoon, Bill." "Truck trouble?" He turned to look at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Bill Morrison had served 2 tours in Vietnam, had seen things that would break most men. But whatever he was looking at had shaken him to his core. "Sheriff," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You need to see this." I followed his gaze up to the telephone wires. Every line, from one end of the visible road to the other, was covered in crows. Not perched, covered. They sat so close together their bodies formed an unbroken black ribbon against the sky. There had to be thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands. And they were all perfectly still. "How long have they been like this?" I asked. "I don't know. They were here when I came around the bend about 10 minutes ago. Haven't moved so much as a feather since." As we watched, one of the birds near the center of the massive flock suddenly dropped from the wire. It fell straight down, hit the asphalt with a wet thud, and lay still. Then another fell. And another. Within minutes, the road was littered with dead crows, their black bodies scattered like punctuation marks across the yellow center line. But the strangest part wasn't the birds falling. It was the way the living ones were watching us. Thousands of black eyes, all turned in our direction. Not the quick, darting gaze of normal birds, but a steady, intelligent stare that seemed to see right through flesh and bone to whatever lay beneath. I felt exposed under that collective gaze, like a bug under a magnifying glass. "We should go," Bill said, backing toward his truck. I wanted to agree with him, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Call it professional curiosity or plain stubbornness, but I needed to understand what I was seeing. I picked up one of the fallen birds, expecting the limp weight of a recent corpse. The crow's body was still warm, but when I looked closer, I realized it hadn't died from any natural cause. Its chest cavity was empty, not torn open, not pecked apart, but simply hollow. As if whatever had been inside had just left. That night, I called Doc Peterson. Doc had been the county coroner for 40 years before retiring, and if anyone would know about strange animal deaths, it would be him. I found him in his study, surrounded by medical journals and case files, reading by the light of an old brass lamp. "Doc, I need to ask you something. You ever see anything like mass bird deaths? Specifically crows?" He looked up from his reading, studying my face with those sharp blue eyes that had examined more corpses than anyone should have to. "Crows are interesting birds, Sheriff. Smarter than most people give them credit for. They remember faces, hold grudges, communicate with each other in ways we're only beginning to understand. But mass deaths? That's unusual. Very unusual. What would cause something like that? Could be disease, environmental factors, poison. But you're not asking about normal causes, are you?" I told him about the past few days, Tommy's feathers, Eleanor's garden, the birds on the telephone wires. Doc listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making a small sound in the back of his throat. "There's something else," I said when I'd finished. "The birds that fell, they were empty inside. Like something had hollowed them out." Doc was quiet for a long moment, staring at something I couldn't see. "My grandfather used to tell stories," he said finally. "Old Cherokee stories he'd heard from his grandmother. About spirits that could inhabit animals, use them like clothing. He called them shadow walkers. Said they were drawn to places where the veil between worlds was thin. You don't believe in that kind of thing, do you, Doc?" "I've seen a lot of things in my time, Sheriff. Some of them had perfectly reasonable explanations. Others," he shrugged. "Let's just say I try to keep an open mind." The fourth day brought the Hendricks family. I found them huddled in my office when I arrived that morning, looking like they'd spent the night running from something. Mark Hendricks worked at the grain elevator on the edge of town, solid and practical as they come. His wife Sarah taught 3rd grade at the elementary school. Their daughter Amy was maybe 6, all pigtails and wide eyes. "Sheriff," Mark said, "we need help. Something's been watching our house." Sarah picked up the story where her husband left off, her voice tight with barely controlled fear. "It started 3 nights ago. Amy woke us up, said there was a man in her room. We checked, didn't find anything, figured it was just a bad dream. But the next night, she woke up again. Same thing. A man in her room, just standing there, watching her sleep. Did you see anything yourself?" "The 3rd night I stayed awake," Mark said. "Sat in the hallway outside Amy's room with a baseball bat. Around 2 in the morning, I heard her start to whimper. Looked in her room, and there was... God, Sheriff, I don't know how to describe it." Amy, who had been coloring quietly in the corner, looked up from her drawing. "It was the bird man," she said matter-of-factly. "He's made of crows. They come together to make his shape, but he's not really there. He just watches." The drawing she'd been working on showed a stick-figure house with a window. In the window was a dark shape that might have been a person, if people were made of overlapping scribbles and shadow. "We packed up and left," Sarah said. "Spent the night at my sister's in Centerville. But Sheriff, we can't keep running. We have jobs, responsibilities. Amy needs to be in her own bed." I drove out to the Hendricks place that afternoon, not sure what I expected to find. The house sat on a small rise about 2 miles outside town proper, surrounded by fields of corn that rustled in the summer breeze. Normal as apple pie, except for the feathers. They were everywhere, scattered across the front porch, stuck in the screens of windows, caught in the branches of the old oak tree that shaded the driveway. And they all shared that same wrong quality I'd seen before: too large, too dark, too heavy with implications I didn't want to consider. Amy's bedroom was on the second floor, overlooking the backyard. I stood at her window, looking out at the cornfield beyond, and tried to imagine what she'd seen. A figure made of crows. Birds that came together to form something that looked human but wasn't. As I watched, the corn began to move. Not the gentle swaying you'd expect from a breeze, but a purposeful rustling that seemed to trace a path through the field. Whatever was causing it was moving in a straight line toward the house, leaving a wake of disturbed stalks behind it. I drew my service weapon, though I wasn't sure what good it would do against something made of birds. The movement in the corn stopped maybe 50 yards from the house, and for a moment everything was perfectly still. Then the crows began to rise. They emerged from the cornfield like smoke, hundreds of them lifting into the air in perfect silence. But instead of scattering, they began to swirl together, forming a loose approximation of human shape. I could see through it. The thing wasn't solid, but the suggestion was unmistakable. A man-shaped void in the sky, outlined in black wings and watching eyes. For maybe 30 seconds, it hung there above the cornfield, rotating slowly like a macabre mobile. Then, without warning, it collapsed. The birds scattered in every direction, their harsh cries finally breaking the silence, and within moments the sky was empty again. But the smell lingered. That copper-sweet stench of old blood and decay, drifting through Amy's open window like a promise. That night, I called a town meeting. It wasn't official. I didn't have the authority to declare some kind of supernatural emergency, but word traveled fast in a place like Millbrook. By 8 o'clock, the high school gymnasium was packed with worried faces and nervous whispers. I stood at the podium they used for basketball games and graduation ceremonies, looking out at my neighbors and friends, and tried to figure out how to explain something I didn't understand myself. "Folks, we've had some unusual incidents in town the past few days. Nothing dangerous, as far as I can tell, but unusual. I want everyone to keep their eyes open, report anything strange they might see. Especially anything involving large numbers of crows." The murmur that went through the crowd told me I wasn't the only one who noticed something wrong. Old Martha Henley stood up in the back row, leaning heavily on her walking stick. "Sheriff, my grandmother used to tell stories about the Crow Man. Said he came around every 50 years or so, when the town got too comfortable, too settled. He'd walk among us for a while, watching, learning. Then one day, he'd take someone back with him to wherever he came from. Mrs. Henley, I appreciate. Last time anyone saw him was 1947. She continued, ignoring my attempt to interrupt. "You're the Caldwell girl disappeared. They found her clothes by Miller's Pond, but never found her. And you know what they found with her clothes? Feathers. Hundreds of black feathers." The gymnasium fell silent. "That was 50 years ago, Sheriff. 50 years exactly." I drove home that night with Martha's words echoing in my mind. 50 years. 1947 to 1997. The kind of precise interval that meant either incredible coincidence or something far worse. I pulled into my driveway around 10:30, exhausted and unsettled, looking forward to a glass of bourbon and whatever mindless program might be on television. But as I reached for my front door, I noticed something that made my hand freeze on the handle. Feathers. 3 of them, placed in a perfect triangle on my welcome mat. Not scattered by wind or accident, but arranged with deliberate precision. The message was clear: we know where you live. I gathered them up, noting they were still warm to the touch, and went inside to pour that bourbon. But sleep was a long time coming, and when it finally arrived, it brought dreams of black wings and empty eyes. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Cindy Patterson, who worked dispatch for the sheriff's department, met me at the door with a face gone gray with worry. "Sheriff, we've got a problem. The Carmichael girl is missing." Jenny Carmichael was 17, a senior at the high school, known for her reliability and good sense. The kind of girl who didn't just disappear without word or warning. "When was she last seen?" "Yesterday evening, around sunset. She was walking home from her job at the grocery store. Her mother expected her by 7, called us when she didn't show up by 9. I organized search parties, called in deputies from neighboring counties, did all the things sheriffs do when a young person goes missing. But even as we combed the woods and fields around town, I had a sick certainty about what we'd find. We found her clothes by Miller's Pond. They were folded neatly on the bank, as if she'd undressed for a swim. But Jenny Carmichael had never been one for swimming, especially not in a muddy farm pond miles from anywhere. And there were no footprints in the soft earth around the water's edge. Just feathers. Hundreds of them, scattered across the ground like black snow. And in the center of it all, pressed into the mud, a footprint that might have been human if humans had feet made of shadows and empty spaces. We dragged the pond for 3 days, brought in divers from the state police, even called in one of those search and rescue dogs. But Jenny Carmichael was gone as surely as if she'd never existed at all. That's when I decided to visit Martha Henley. I found her on her front porch as always, glass of sweet tea sweating in the heat, eyes fixed on a sky that had been unnaturally dark all week despite the complete absence of clouds. "You come about the girl," she said before I could speak. "Mrs. Henley, you mentioned your grandmother's stories. About the Crow Man. I need to know everything you remember." She was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. Then she began to speak, her voice carrying the weight of old knowledge and older fears. "My grandmother was Cherokee, born in these mountains before the white men came. She said the Crow Man wasn't a man at all, but something that wore the shape of one. A hunger-given form. He fed on something people carried inside them. Something precious. What kind of something? Hope, maybe. Or joy. The thing that makes a person truly alive. He'd take someone young, someone with their whole life ahead of them, and he'd drain them empty. Leave behind just the shell. But you said he only came every 50 years. Martha nodded slowly. He needs time to digest what he's taken, to make it part of himself. But Sheriff, the thing my grandmother always said, the thing that scared her most? He doesn't just take one person. He takes them all, eventually. One at a time, over the years, until there's nothing left of a place but empty houses and forgotten names. How do you stop something like that? You don't. You can't fight hunger itself. All you can do is make sure he doesn't get what he came for." That night, I sat in my office with all the reports spread out before me, trying to make sense of what I was dealing with. Tommy's feathers. Eleanor's dead garden. The birds on the telephone wires. The thing watching the Hendricks house. And now Jenny Carmichael, gone without a trace. But it was Martha's words that kept coming back to me. He doesn't just take one person. He takes them all. I thought about the Caldwell girl, disappeared in 1947. Then I started digging through old records, looking for patterns I might have missed. What I found made my blood run cold. Every 50 years, going back as far as the records went, someone disappeared from Millbrook. Always a young person. Always near water. Always with their clothes left behind, neatly folded, surrounded by black feathers. 1897, Thomas Mitchell, age 19, vanished from Miller's Pond. 1847, Sarah Louise Johnson, age 16, disappeared from the same location. 1797, records were sketchy, but there were references to a missing Cherokee girl named Running Deer. The pattern went back centuries, maybe longer. A harvest of youth and hope, collected like interest on some cosmic debt. But there was something else in those old records, something that gave me the first glimmer of an idea. In 1897, the year Thomas Mitchell disappeared, there had been another death. An old woman named Mercy Whitlock, found dead in her cabin the same night Thomas vanished. The official cause was listed as natural causes, but there was a note in the margin, written in the careful script of some long-dead deputy, found surrounded by dead crows. Hundreds of them. Mercy Whitlock had been the town's unofficial wise woman, the person people went to for healing and advice. And according to the faded newspaper clipping I found, she'd spent her last day warning people about something she called the shadow that walks in flesh. The next night, I drove out to the old Whitlock place. The cabin was still there, though decades of neglect had reduced it to little more than a shell. Vines covered the walls, the roof had partially collapsed, and the windows were long since broken. But something about the place felt protected. Sanctified, maybe? Like whatever had happened here had left an invisible barrier against the darkness. I found what I was looking for in the ruins of what had once been the kitchen. Carved into the stone hearth, almost invisible beneath layers of soot and age, were symbols I didn't recognize. Cherokee, maybe, or something older. They seemed to shift and writhe in the light of my flashlight, never quite holding still long enough for me to get a clear look. But there was something else carved there, too. Words in English, scratched deep into the stone. What hungers must feed. What feeds must sleep. What sleeps can be bound. I was still staring at those words when I heard the sound of wings. It started soft, like distant thunder, then grew louder. The beating of hundreds, maybe thousands of wings, all moving in perfect synchronization. I stepped outside the ruined cabin and looked up to see the sky filled with birds. They moved like a single organism, flowing and shifting against the stars, forming shapes that almost made sense before dissolving into chaos again. And at the center of it all, that familiar man-shaped void, watching me with eyes made of night and hunger. For a moment, we regarded each other across the impossible distance. Then the thing that wasn't quite a man raised one arm, or the suggestion of an arm, and pointed directly at me. The message was clear: you're next. The flock scattered, disappearing into the darkness, leaving me alone with the smell of copper and decay. I drove back to town with my mind racing, Martha's words and Mercy Whitlock's carving battling for space in my thoughts. What sleeps can be bound? But how do you bind something made of shadows and hunger? How do you fight an enemy that exists in the spaces between reality? I was so lost in thought that I almost missed the figure standing in the middle of Main Street. It looked like a person at first glance, tall and thin and perfectly still. But as I got closer, I realized it was wrong in every possible way. The proportions were off, arms too long, torso too narrow, head tilted at an angle that should have been impossible. And it was translucent, like smoke given shape and purpose. I stopped the patrol car maybe 50 feet away and rolled down the window. "What do you want?" I called out. The thing turned its head toward me, and I saw its face was made of smaller faces, dozens of them, all crowded together, all with their mouths open and silent screams. But the eyes were the worst part. They were human eyes, filled with terror and desperation and the awful knowledge of what had been done to them. When it spoke, the voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. I want what was promised. I want what is owed. Nobody owes you anything. 50 years of interest, Sheriff. 50 years of compound growth. The debt has grown large indeed. I thought about Jenny Carmichael, about all the others who had disappeared over the centuries. Young people with their whole lives ahead of them, reduced to components in this thing's collection. You already took the girl. That should be enough. One is never enough. It never has been. I hunger, Sheriff, and this place feeds me well. The thing began to move toward my car, its form shifting and rippling like heat waves rising from summer pavement. As it got closer, I could see the individual crows that made up its structure, all of them perfectly still, their eyes reflecting my headlights like tiny mirrors. You cannot stop what has already begun, it said. I am woven into this place now, part of its history, part of its future. Every 50 years I return. Every 50 years I feed. And when I have taken enough, when I have drained this place of everything that makes it alive, I will move on to the next place. And the next? How many places? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. How many stars are in the sky, Sheriff? How many grains of sand on the beach? I am old, and I am patient, and I am very, very hungry. The thing was almost to my car now, close enough that I could smell the decay rolling off it in waves. Close enough to see that some of the crows making up its form were missing feathers, their pink skin showing through in patches like diseased flesh. I thought about Mercy Whitlock's carving, about the symbols carved into her hearth, about the dead birds they'd found around her body. And suddenly I understood. She hadn't died of natural causes. She'd sacrifice herself, use her own life force to bind the thing, to send it back to whatever hell had spawned it. But the binding was temporary, lasting only until the next cycle, the next 50-year harvest. Unless someone renewed it. I put the car in reverse and backed away from the thing, my mind already formulating a plan I didn't like but couldn't see any alternative to. The creature watched me go, its head tilting at that impossible angle, and I could swear I heard it laughing. I spent the rest of the night in the town library, digging through historical records and old books, looking for anything that might tell me more about binding spirits or banishing demons. What I found was frustrating in its vagueness, references to old ways, and blood prices, and willing sacrifice. But one thing was clear, whatever Mercy Whitlock had done, it had required her life. The next day, I called Doc Peterson. Doc, I need to ask you something, and I need you to give me a straight answer. That story your grandfather told you, about the shadow walkers. Did he ever mention how to get rid of one? Doc was quiet for a long moment. He said they could be bound, but only by someone who understood the price. Someone willing to pay it. What kind of price? The same thing they feed on, Sheriff. Life force. Hope. The spark that makes us human. You can bind them with that, tie them to a place or an object or a person. But the binding doesn't last forever. Eventually it needs to be renewed. How often? Every 50 years, give or take. I hung up the phone and sat in my office, staring at the wall and thinking about Jenny Carmichael, about all the young people who had disappeared over the centuries, about the thing that was even now planning its next meal. That evening, I drove out to Miller's Pond. I found the thing waiting for me, standing at the water's edge like some perverted fisherman. In the fading light, it looked almost human, but the illusion fell apart the moment you looked closely. Its edges were too soft, its shadow fell in the wrong direction, and when it moved, you could see the individual birds shifting and adjusting to maintain the approximation of human form. "Sheriff," it said as I approached. "I wondered when you would come. I'm here to make a deal." "Ah. And what could you possibly offer me that I cannot simply take?" "Myself." The thing went very still, and for a moment the only sound was the gentle lapping of water against the muddy shore. "Explain. You want to feed on this town, fine. But you do it through me. I bind you, tie you to my life force instead of theirs. You get what you need, and they get to live their lives in peace. And what do you get out of this arrangement, Sheriff? I get to know they're safe. That's enough." The creature moved closer, and I could see my reflection multiplied in hundreds of black eyes. "You would sacrifice yourself for people who will never know what you've done? Who will never understand the price you've paid? That's what the job is about sometimes. And when you die, Sheriff? When your binding fails and I am free again? Then that's someone else's problem." The thing that called itself the Crow Man studied me for a long moment, its head tilted at that impossible angle. Then it smiled, and its smile was made of beaks and shadows. "I accept your offer. But Sheriff, I think you misunderstand the nature of the binding. When I am tied to your life force, I become part of you. Your thoughts, your memories, your very soul. We will be intimate, you and I. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about Jenny Carmichael, about Amy Hendricks waking up scared in the middle of the night, about all the young people who would disappear if I walked away. "I'm prepared." "Then let us begin." What happened next is hard to describe, because it happened mostly inside my head. The creature reached out with something that wasn't quite a hand, touched something that wasn't quite my forehead, and suddenly I could feel it pouring into me like cold water into an empty vessel. The hunger hit me first, a vast, yawning emptiness that threatened to swallow everything I was. Then came the memories, centuries of them, images of all the people it had taken over the years. I saw their faces, felt their terror, experienced their final moments, as if they were my own. But underneath it all, threading through the darkness like a silver wire, was something unexpected: loneliness. The thing was ancient and powerful and utterly, completely alone. It had been feeding for so long that it had forgotten why it started, had been hunting for so many centuries that predation had become its only identity. And now it was bound to me, tethered to my mortal life and mortal understanding, and for the first time in eons, it wasn't alone. The binding took most of the night. When it was finished, I felt different. Heavier somehow, as if I was carrying a weight that existed in dimensions I couldn't see. The Crow Man was still there, still separate from me, but connected now in ways I was only beginning to understand. "It is done," he said, though whether he spoke aloud or directly into my mind, I couldn't tell. "You have bought your people 50 years, Sheriff. Perhaps more, if you live long enough. And you? What do you get out of this?" "I get to remember what it was like to be human. Through you, I will experience kindness, compassion, love, all the things I have forgotten in my hunger. It has been a very long time since I felt such things." He began to fade as the sun rose, becoming translucent, then invisible. But I could still feel him there, a presence in the back of my mind, watching through my eyes, feeling through my heart. "Will anyone else be taken?" I asked the empty air. "Not while you live, Sheriff. That was our bargain." And then he was gone, or at least hidden so deeply inside me that I couldn't sense him anymore. I drove back to town as the sun painted the sky pink and gold, feeling simultaneously exhausted and strangely energized. The weight of what I'd done settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket, but underneath it was something I hadn't expected: relief. The people of Millbrook County would sleep safely in their beds. Their children would grow up and leave town and live their lives without ever knowing about the thing that had once stalked their streets. And when they found Jenny Carmichael's body, because they would find it, eventually, though not where anyone expected, they would assume she'd been the victim of some perfectly ordinary tragedy. That was 3 months ago. The Crow Man keeps his word. No one else has disappeared. No one else has reported strange sightings or unusual behavior from the local wildlife. Life in Millbrook has returned to its normal rhythms of work and church and Friday night football games. But I know he's still there, bound to me now, sharing my thoughts and memories and dreams. Sometimes I catch glimpses of him in mirrors, standing just behind my reflection. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night to find black feathers on my pillow. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my office late at night, I can hear him whispering in the darkness, telling me stories of all the places he's been, all the things he's seen. He's curious about human emotions, asks me questions about love and friendship and hope. I try to answer as best I can, though how do you explain joy to something that has known only hunger? How do you describe compassion to a creature that has spent centuries as a predator? But I think he's learning. Yesterday, I saw a child fall off his bicycle in front of the courthouse, and for just a moment, I felt something that wasn't quite my own emotion, a flicker of concern, of sympathy for the boy's tears. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. Maybe that's enough. Maybe binding him to a human life will change him, teach him what he's forgotten in all his years of feeding. Maybe when I die and the binding fails, he'll remember enough of what it means to be human that he'll choose a different path. Or maybe I'm just an old fool who made a deal with the devil and is trying to convince himself it was the right thing to do. Either way, the people of Millbrook County are safe. They go about their lives never knowing how close they came to becoming food for something ancient and hungry. They complain about taxes and gossip about their neighbors and worry about whether their children are getting good grades in school, and it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Because that's what normal life looks like when you've seen the alternative. I've got maybe 10, 15 years left in me, if I'm lucky. When I'm gone, someone else will have to deal with what comes next. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about who I might pass this burden to, and how I could possibly explain what they'd be taking on. But that's a problem for tomorrow. Today, I've got reports to file and patrol routes to run and citizens to protect. Same as always, except now I'm protecting them from something they'll never see coming. The strange thing is, I don't regret it. Not the binding, not the sacrifice, not the weight I carry in my chest like a stone. Every morning when I wake up and see the sun shining on familiar faces, when I hear children laughing in the school playground, when I watch young couples holding hands on Main Street, I know I made the right choice. Because that's what sheriffs do. We stand between the darkness and the light, between the known and the unknown. We carry the weight so others don't have to. Even if that weight has teeth and wings and whispers to us in the small hours of the night. Martha Henley stopped by my office last week. She's 93 now, moving slower but still sharp as a tack. She sat in the chair across from my desk and studied my face with those knowing eyes. "You look different, Sheriff," she said finally. "Older. Like you're carrying something heavy." "We all carry things, Mrs. Henley." "Yes, but some burdens are heavier than others." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "My grandmother told me something else about the Crow Man. Something I didn't mention before." "What's that?" "She said sometimes, if the binding was strong enough, if the person doing the binding was pure enough in their intentions, it could change him. Make him remember what he used to be, before the hunger took hold." "What did he used to be?" Martha smiled, but it was a sad smile, full of old knowledge and older pain. "Human, Sheriff. Just like you and me. The hunger made him into something else, but underneath all that darkness, he's still got a soul. And souls can be redeemed, given the right circumstances. She left without saying anything else, but her words stayed with me. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the thing bound to my life force breathing in rhythm with my own heartbeat, I found myself wondering about redemption. About second chances. About the possibility that even the darkest creatures might find their way back to the light. It's a nice thought. Maybe even a true one. But I'm not taking any chances. I've started keeping a journal, writing down everything I know about the binding, about the creature, about what it takes to keep it contained. When my time comes, when age or illness or simple human frailty finally claims me, whoever takes over this job will at least have a roadmap. Because that's the thing about small towns, about places like Millbrook County. We take care of our own. We pass down our knowledge, our traditions, our responsibilities from one generation to the next. The good and the bad, the light and the dark. And sometimes, if we're very careful and very lucky, we manage to keep the darkness at bay long enough for the light to grow stronger. I can feel him stirring now, the thing that shares my thoughts and my memories. He's curious about this story, about why I'm telling it, about what I hope to accomplish by putting these words down on paper. I tell him it's because people need to know. Not everyone, not the general population who sleep better in their ignorance, but someone. The right someone. The person who will take up this burden when I can no longer carry it. He asks me if I'm afraid of dying, of what will happen to the binding when my heart stops beating and my brain stops thinking. I tell him I'm terrified. But I also tell him I have hope. Hope that the binding has changed him as much as it's changed me. Hope that when the time comes, he'll remember what it feels like to care about something other than his own hunger. Hope that 50 years of sharing a human soul will be enough to tip the balance toward light instead of darkness. He doesn't answer, but I can feel something stirring in the depths of our shared consciousness. Not quite emotion, not yet, but the possibility of emotion. The shadow of what feeling might look like if it ever fully formed. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's how redemption works, not all at once, in a blaze of divine light, but slowly, quietly, one small moment of understanding at a time. I guess we'll find out. Until then, I've got a job to do. A town to protect. A balance to maintain between the world people know and the world they never want to discover. And somewhere in the darkness behind my eyes, something that was once a predator learns what it means to be human, one heartbeat at a time. When the sky blackens without clouds, you know he's near. But maybe, if we're very lucky and very careful, that's not always a bad thing anymore. Time will tell. It always does. I followed the trail of fur, and it led me somewhere I should have never gone. That was 37 years ago, and I still wake up some nights with the taste of copper pennies in my mouth and the sound of wind chimes where there shouldn't be any wind. Millbrook's been my home for 6 decades, sheriff for 42 of those years before I retired, and in all that time I thought I'd seen every kind of strange this place could conjure up. Small towns breed their own peculiar darkness, you understand. Secrets ferment in the spaces between houses, in the gaps where neighbors don't quite meet each other's eyes. But what happened during the blood moon of October 1987 wasn't the usual brand of small-town strange. It was something else entirely. The morning started ordinary enough. Tuesday, October 20th. And I was sitting in my office nursing a cup of coffee that could have stripped paint when Mrs. Henderson came bustling through the door like a woman possessed. She had this way of walking that made it seem like the ground was trying to trip her up, all elbows and urgency. "Sheriff, it's Buster," she said, her voice pitched high enough to make the windows rattle. "He's gone." Buster was her tabby cat, fat as a Christmas turkey and about as energetic as molasses in January. The idea of him going anywhere under his own power was mildly amusing, but I've learned that in small towns, missing pets can be as serious as missing persons. Sometimes more serious, depending on who's doing the missing. When did you last see him? Yesterday evening. Had his supper, same as always. Fancy feast, the kind with the salmon. He was sitting on the porch when I went to bed, and this morning. She wrung her hands like she was trying to squeeze water from them. Just his collar, Sheriff. Sitting there on the welcome mat like someone placed it there deliberate like. I wrote it down in my notebook, the kind with the spiral binding that catches on everything. Missing cat, collar left behind. Seemed odd, but cats are odd creatures to begin with. Maybe Buster had finally decided to explore the great outdoors, slipped his collar on a fence post or tree branch. I'll keep an eye out for him, Mrs. Henderson. He'll probably come home when he gets hungry enough. She left, but not before giving me a look that suggested I wasn't taking the matter with appropriate seriousness. I might have forgotten about it entirely if Tom Brookshire hadn't walked in an hour later with the exact same story. His dog Rex, a golden retriever with a brain the size of a walnut but a heart bigger than Texas, had vanished overnight. Only his collar remained, sitting in the middle of the backyard like an offering. By noon, I had 7 more reports. Dogs, cats, even Mrs. Patterson's ancient parrot that hadn't moved from its perch in living memory. All gone. All leaving only their collars behind. That afternoon, I drove the streets of Millbrook with my windows down, listening. Towns have their own rhythms, their own sounds. The hum of air conditioners, lawn mowers, children playing. But there was something missing from Millbrook's usual symphony. No dogs barking. No cats yowling. Even the birds seemed quieter, as if they were holding their breath. I stopped by the Rexall to pick up some antacid. My stomach had been acting up all day, churning like a washing machine with a bad bearing, and Earl behind the counter looked like he'd seen a ghost. Sheriff, you hear about all these pets going missing? I'm hearing about it firsthand. Yours too? He nodded toward a picture behind the register, a little terrier with one ear that stood up and one that flopped down. Ginger. Found her collar this morning, sitting right in the middle of my driveway. Strangest thing, though, it was warm. Warm? Like it had been sitting in the sun all day, even though I found it at 6 in the morning. He rubbed his neck, leaving red marks where his fingers dug in. And it smelled funny. Sweet, but not good sweet. Sickly sweet. I made a note of that. Warm collars. Sweet smell. The antacid wasn't helping my stomach any. The town square sits at the heart of Millbrook like a hub on a wheel, with 4 streets radiating out to the cardinal directions. It's not much to look at, a patch of grass with some benches, a Civil War monument that's been listing to one side since I was a boy, and an old oak tree that's probably been there since before the Civil War itself. But that evening, as the sun was setting and painting the sky the color of old blood, the square had something new. A pile. I saw it from 2 blocks away, sitting at the base of the oak tree like some kind of modern art installation. As I got closer, my stomach clenched tighter. Collars. Dozens of them, piled up in a perfect circle around the tree trunk. Leather and nylon, chain and cloth, tags catching the dying light like fallen stars. I counted them. 43 collars, representing every pet that had been reported missing that day. But it was the way they were arranged that made my hands shake as I lit my cigarette. Not tossed or dropped, but placed. Carefully. Deliberately. Each one positioned just so, creating a pattern that hurt to look at directly. The smell hit me as I got closer. Sweet, like Earl had said, but with an undertone of something else. Something that reminded me of the slaughterhouse outside of town, the smell that would drift over on summer evenings when the wind was wrong. I called it in, though what I was calling it I couldn't rightly say. Vandalism? Theft? The state boys would have laughed me out of the county if I'd told them someone had stolen 43 pets and left their collars in a neat pile. But standing there in the gathering dusk, with that smell getting stronger and the first stars beginning to peek through the darkening sky, I knew this wasn't any kind of prank. The moon was rising, and it was wrong. Not wrong in any way I could put my finger on, but wrong nonetheless. Too red, too large, hanging in the sky like a drop of blood about to fall. A blood moon, the kind that happens during a lunar eclipse, though I couldn't recall hearing about any eclipse scheduled for that night. I stood there until full dark, watching that pile of collars, waiting for, what? For the pets to come home? For someone to step out of the shadows and explain what this was all about? For the whole thing to make sense? None of those things happened. What did happen was worse. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes, and the air grew thick as honey. The street lights flickered and dimmed, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow that made the shadows seem deeper than they should be. And from somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of wind chimes. Now, Millbrook isn't the kind of place where people hang wind chimes. We're practical folk, more concerned with function than decoration. But there it was, a soft metallic tinkling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was pretty, in a way, but it made my teeth ache and my skin crawl. I walked the perimeter of the square, looking for any sign of what might have happened. No footprints in the soft earth around the tree. No tire tracks. No evidence that anyone had been there at all, except for that impossible pile of collars. The wind chimes grew louder. I followed the sound, though every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back in my patrol car and drive home. But that's not what you do when you're sheriff. You investigate. You find answers. You protect and serve, even when protecting and serving means walking towards something that makes your spine feel like it's full of ice water. The sound led me away from the square, down Elm Street toward the old part of town. The houses here were older, built back when Millbrook was first settled, and they had that particular quality that old houses get. They seemed to lean inward, as if they were sharing secrets. The wind chimes grew stronger with each step, until it was less like music and more like a conversation I couldn't quite understand. It was then I saw the fur. Just a tuft at first, caught on a mailbox post. Golden retriever fur, the kind that gets everywhere and sticks to everything. A few steps further, another tuft. Then another. A trail of fur leading away from the center of town, out toward the old quarry road. I should have gone back for backup. Should have called the state police, or at least radioed in my location. But something about that night made normal procedures seem inadequate. This wasn't a situation you could handle with handcuffs and a citation book. So I followed the trail. The fur led me past the last of the houses, out where the street lights gave way to darkness, and the only illumination came from that blood-red moon hanging overhead like a watchful eye. It was quiet out there, the kind of quiet that presses against your eardrums and makes you aware of your own heartbeat. Even the wind chimes had faded to a whisper. The quarry road hasn't been used for anything official in 20 years. It's just a dirt track now, overgrown with weeds and barely wide enough for one car. But someone had been using it recently. The grass was pressed down, and there were marks in the soft earth that might have been footprints if footprints came in sizes that big. The trail of fur continued, getting thicker as I walked. Not just golden retriever now, but tabby cat fur, German shepherd, even some feathers that looked like they might have come from Mrs. Patterson's parrot. It was like following breadcrumbs in a fairy tale, except the breadcrumbs were evidence of something I didn't want to think about too closely. 3 miles down that road, the trail stopped. I stood there in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by woods that had been logged over so many times they looked like bad haircuts. and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The fur trail just ended. Right there in the middle of the road, as if whatever had been carrying it had simply vanished into thin air. But it was what I found 20 feet into the woods that made me seriously consider early retirement. A clearing. Perfectly circular, about 50 feet across, with earth that looked like it had been burned. Not recently. The burn was old, maybe decades old, but nothing grew there except for some kind of pale grass that moved without any wind to move it. And in the center of that clearing was a hole. Not a big hole, maybe 3 feet across and perfectly round, like someone had used a giant cookie cutter on the earth. But it was deep. Deep enough that when I dropped a pebble into it, I never heard it hit bottom. The smell was stronger here. That sweet, sick smell, rising up from the hole like breath from a diseased lung. And underneath it, something else. Something that made me think of old meat and older secrets. I had my flashlight, a big mag light that could double as a club if needed, but when I shone it down into that hole, the beam just seemed to get swallowed up. It went down about 10 feet, and then, nothing. Just darkness so complete it seemed solid. That's when I heard the wind chimes again. But they weren't coming from the forest around me. They were coming from below, rising up out of that hole like an invitation. And mixed in with the metallic tinkling, I could swear I heard something else. Voices, maybe? Or sounds that wanted to be voices. I knelt at the edge of that hole, my flashlight beam disappearing into nothing, and I listened. Really listened, the way you listen when you're trying to hear your neighbor's argument through thin walls. And what I heard down there in that darkness made me understand why every pet in Millbrook had vanished. They were still there. All of them. I could hear them calling. Not barking or meowing, nothing that simple. But calling nonetheless, in voices that sounded almost but not quite like the pets they'd been. Rex the golden retriever, trying to bark but producing something that sounded more like words. Buster the tabby, purring in a rhythm that almost sounded like Morse code. Mrs. Patterson's parrot, squawking syllables that wanted to form sentences. And underneath it all, something else responding. Something with a voice like grinding stone and honey, speaking in a language that predated words but carried meaning nonetheless. It was a conversation, I realized. A negotiation. I backed away from that hole so fast I nearly fell over my own feet. Whatever was happening down there, whatever those sounds meant, I knew with absolute certainty that I didn't want to be part of it. Some doors are meant to stay closed, some holes are meant to stay unfilled, and some conversations are meant to happen without human witnesses. But as I turned to leave, I heard something that stopped me cold. My name. Not spoken, exactly, but sang. Hummed. Chimed. Like the wind chimes themselves were trying to form the syllables of my name, and pull me back toward that hole. Sheriff. 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 I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran like a man half my age with twice my sense, crashing through the underbrush and stumbling down that quarry road like the devil himself was at my heels. Maybe he was. Maybe it was something worse than the devil. I made it back to town just as the moon was setting, its red light fading to the normal pale silver of an ordinary night. The pile of collars was gone from the town square, vanished as completely as the pets themselves. By the time the sun came up, it was like the whole thing had never happened. Except for the missing pets. 43 animals, gone without a trace. I filed a report, of course. Listed them all as missing, though I kept the details vague. No mention of the pile of collars, the hole in the woods, or the conversation I'd overheard in the darkness. Some things don't belong in official reports. Some things don't belong in the daylight world at all. People moved on, the way people do. Got new pets, told themselves the old ones had run away or been stolen by someone from the next county over. Life in Millbrook returned to normal, or as normal as life ever gets in a place where the shadows are a little too deep and the quiet is a little too complete. But I knew better. I'd heard the truth down in that hole, in the conversation between the taken and the taker. The pets hadn't been stolen or killed or even transformed, exactly. They'd been recruited. Invited to be part of something larger and older than human understanding. Something that lived in the spaces between things, in the dark places where moonlight couldn't reach. And sometimes, on nights when the moon is red and the air smells sweet with promises, I can still hear them calling from beneath the earth. Not crying for help or begging to come home, but singing. Harmonizing with voices that predate civilization, adding their own small notes to an ancient song. The hole is still there, if you know where to look. Still perfectly round, still impossibly deep, still breathing that sweet sick smell into the night air. I've never gone back, learned my lesson about following trails that lead to places you shouldn't go, but I know it's there. Waiting. Because that's the thing about some kinds of darkness. They don't go away just because you stop looking at them. They just wait, patient as stones, for the next blood moon to rise and the next offering to be made. And there will be a next time. There always is, in places like Millbrook where the old things sleep light and the barriers between worlds are thin as tissue paper. It might be pets again, or it might be something else. Something larger. Sometimes I wonder if that's why I stayed sheriff for so long after what I should have retired. Not out of duty or dedication, but because someone needs to know. Someone needs to watch for the signs and listen for the wind chimes that play without any wind. Someone needs to be ready to follow the trail when it appears again, even knowing it leads somewhere no one should ever go. I'm getting old now. Too old to be chasing mysteries through the woods or kneeling at the edges of holes that breed darkness into the world. But the knowing doesn't fade, and neither does the responsibility. So I've been training my replacement, though I haven't told him everything. Can't tell him everything, not yet. Some knowledge has to be earned, paid for with sleepless nights and the taste of copper pennies that never quite goes away. But when the time comes, and it will come, as sure as the seasons change and the moon rises red, he'll understand. He'll hear the wind chimes calling and smell the sweet sick promise in the air, and he'll know that some trails are meant to be followed, even when they lead to places that shouldn't exist. That's the burden of keeping the peace in a place like Millbrook. Not just protecting people from each other, but protecting them from the things that live in the spaces between thoughts, in the darkness that existed before the first light was ever struck. The things that wait beneath the earth with infinite patience, adding new voices to their ancient choir one blood moon at a time. I followed the trail of fur, and it led me somewhere I should have never gone. But sometimes someone has to go to the places they shouldn't, just to make sure those places stay where they belong. In the dark. Underground. Singing their patient songs until the stars burn out and the last red moon sets over the last small town, where the shadows are deeper than they should be and the quiet holds more than silence. That's the truth of what happened in Millbrook 37 years ago. The pets didn't run away or get stolen or die of old age. They joined something older than memory, something that collects voices like other things collect stamps or coins. And on nights when the wind is still and the moon hangs red and heavy in the sky, you can still hear them if you know how to listen. Calling from the deep places. Singing in harmony with things that have no names. Waiting for the next blood moon to rise over Millbrook, and the next offering to be made to the darkness that lives beneath our feet. The trail always leads somewhere you shouldn't go. But sometimes someone has to follow it anyway. If you hear splashing after midnight, don't look out the window. That's what my grandmother used to tell me when I was knee-high to a grasshopper, back when this town still had a name that people spoke without whispering. Course, she never told me why. Grandmothers from that generation, they hoarded their reasons like winter wheat, doling them out only when the seasons turned desperate. I wish I'd pressed her for more before the cancer took her voice, then her breath, then finally her warnings along with it. I've been sheriff of this place for 37 years now, and I can tell you that some warnings are worth their weight in blood. The one about midnight splashing? That's carved deeper into my bones than the arthritis that wakes me most mornings. Because I looked once. Just once. And what I saw crawling up from the Blackwater River on that October night in 1987 still visits my dreams when the moon's dark and the air tastes of coming rain. The thing about small towns is they keep their secrets the way old houses keep their dust, settled deep in places you don't think to look until something forces you to move the furniture. Our town sits in a bowl between three hills, with the Blackwater cutting through it like a lazy scar. Population hovers around 800 souls, though that number's been dropping steady since the mill closed in '82. Folks move away, but the river stays. Always stays. October of '87 started like any other. Leaves turning the color of dried blood, harvest moon hanging fat and yellow over the hills most nights. The air held that peculiar stillness that comes before the season tips fully into winter, not quite cold enough for frost, but carrying promises of it in every breath. I remember thinking it felt like the town was holding its breath, waiting for something. The first call came on a Tuesday morning. Mrs. Henderson, who lived in the white two-story on Elm Street, the one with the wraparound porch and the rose bushes that never seemed to bloom quite right. She called to report that something had been in her backyard during the night. Not burglars, she was quick to clarify. Something else. "Sheriff," she said, her voice carrying that particular tremor that comes when folks are trying to convince themselves they didn't see what they saw. "There's marks in my garden. Drag marks. Like something heavy got pulled across the tomato plants toward the river." Mrs. Henderson was 73 years old and sharp as a tack. She'd lived in that house for 46 years, tended that garden like it was her own child. If she said there were drag marks, there were drag marks. I drove over there around 10 that morning. October's sun was doing its best to cut through the growing chill, but it felt thin, watery. Like it was losing interest in the job. The Henderson place sat about 200 yards from the riverbank, with a clear line of sight through a stand of birch trees that had already dropped most of their leaves. The marks were there, all right. Gouged deep into the earth, running from the middle of her vegetable patch straight toward the water. But here's what made my skin prickle. They weren't the kind of marks you'd expect from someone dragging a body or a heavy sack. These were too wide, too deliberate. Like something with considerable bulk had pulled itself along the ground, using whatever appendages it possessed to grip and haul forward. "Did you hear anything?" I asked Mrs. Henderson as she stood beside me, arms wrapped tight around her sweater despite the mild morning temperature. "Splashing," she said without hesitation. "Around midnight, maybe a little after. Thought it might be kids swimming, but—" She gestured toward the drag marks. "Kids don't make tracks like that." I knelt down beside one of the deeper gouges. The earth was still damp, and there was something else mixed in with the soil. A smell I couldn't quite place, something between river water and spoiled meat, with an undertone that reminded me of the way copper pennies taste when you hold them on your tongue too long. "You didn't look outside when you heard the splashing?" Mrs. Henderson's face went pale. "My grandmother always told us never to look at the river after midnight. Said there were things that came up from the deep parts, things that didn't like being watched." There it was again. Another grandmother's warning, another piece of inherited wisdom that most folks would dismiss as superstition. But I was starting to learn that in places like our town, superstition and survival often wore the same face. I spent another hour examining the scene, taking photographs, measuring the distance between the drag marks. They were spaced about 4 feet apart and ran in perfectly parallel lines for nearly 100 yards before disappearing into the cattails at the river's edge. Whatever had made them possessed a symmetry that spoke of purpose, not random movement. The next call came 3 days later. Jerry Milhouse, who ran the hardware store and lived in the converted apartment above it. His building sat closer to the river than Mrs. Henderson's place, maybe 150 yards from the bank. Jerry wasn't the type to call the sheriff unless something was genuinely wrong. He was one of those self-reliant men who'd rather fix a problem with his own hands than ask for help. "Sheriff, I need you to come take a look at something," he said when I answered the phone. His voice carried a weight I'd never heard before, like he was speaking through water. "It's about what happened last night." Jerry was waiting for me on his front steps when I arrived. He looked like he'd aged 5 years since I'd seen him the previous week, skin gray and drawn, eyes carrying that hollow look that comes from seeing something that doesn't fit into the comfortable boundaries of the everyday world. "It was around midnight," he began without preamble. "I was up late working on the books, had the window open to catch some air. That's when I heard the splashing. I felt something cold settle in my stomach." "Go on." "At first I thought it was just a beaver or maybe a muskrat. But the sound was too regular. Like something was moving through the water with purpose. So He stopped, ran a hand through his thinning hair. "I looked out the window." The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Jerry stared at the ground, and I could see his hands trembling slightly. "What did you see?" "Things," he said finally. "Things coming up out of the water. Pale things, moving low to the ground. They didn't have—" He swallowed hard. "They didn't have eyes, Sheriff. Just smooth skin where eyes should be. But they moved like they could see everything." I felt the world tilt slightly, the way it does when you stand up too fast or look down from a great height. "How many?" "3, maybe 4. Hard to tell in the moonlight. They were searching for something, moving their heads back and forth, like dogs following a scent trail. And they were heading away from the river, toward town." Jerry led me around to the back of his building. Like Mrs. Henderson's garden, the ground here told a story I didn't want to read. More drag marks, these ones deeper and more numerous. They started at the river's edge and came right up to the base of Jerry's building, where they circled around the foundation like something had been testing the walls, looking for a way inside. But it was what Jerry showed me next that made my mouth go dry. On the side of the building, about 3 feet up from the ground, were marks in the wood siding. Not claw marks or scratches, but impressions. Like something had pressed against the wall with considerable force, leaving behind the outline of appendages. They were roughly hand-shaped but wrong in ways that made my eyes want to slide away from them. Too long, too flexible, with what looked like suckers or some kind of gripping surface instead of fingers. "They were trying to get in," Jerry said quietly. "I could hear them moving around the building, pressing against the walls. It went on for maybe 20 minutes, then they just left. Went back toward the river. I took more photographs, made more measurements. The impressions in the wood were deep enough that whatever had made them possessed considerable strength. More disturbing was the pattern they'd left behind, a systematic exploration of the building's exterior, as if something had been methodically testing for weaknesses. "Jerry," I said as I packed up my camera, "I need you to do something for me. If you hear that splashing again, don't look outside. And make sure all your windows and doors are locked tight before you go to bed." He nodded, but I could see in his eyes that he was already planning to leave town for a while. Smart man. The third incident happened 5 days later, and it changed everything. Sarah Chin lived alone in a small ranch house on Poplar Street, about a quarter mile from the river. She was 26 years old, worked as a nurse at the county hospital, and had moved to town just 2 years earlier when she'd inherited the house from her great-aunt. Sarah was practical, level-headed, not given to flights of fancy or supernatural nonsense, which made what she told me all the more disturbing. She called at 6 in the morning, her voice shaking so badly I could barely understand her. "Sheriff, please come quickly. Something tried to get into my house last night. Something that shouldn't exist." I was at her place within 10 minutes. Sarah met me at the door wrapped in a bathrobe, her face sheet white and her hands clutching a baseball bat like it was a lifeline. She led me through the house to the back bedroom, where the window overlooked her small backyard and the river beyond. The window was intact, but the screen had been removed from the outside and lay crumpled on the ground below. On the glass itself were marks, the same kind of impressions I'd seen on Jerry's building, but these were more extensive. Whatever had made them had spent considerable time and effort trying to find a way through the window. "I woke up around midnight to the sound of splashing," Sarah said, her voice steadier now but still carrying an undertone of barely controlled terror. "At first I thought it might be someone swimming, even though the water's too cold this time of year. But then I heard something else. A sound like wet things moving across the ground." She led me outside to examine the area beneath the bedroom window. The drag marks were there, of course, but they were different from the others I'd seen. These were more frantic, more chaotic. As if whatever had made them had been excited or agitated. "I looked out the window," Sarah continued. "I know I shouldn't have, but I had to know what was making those sounds." My blood turned to ice water. "What did you see?" "A thing," she said simply. "Pale, about the size of a person but wrong. It was pressed against the glass, and I could see it didn't have eyes. Just smooth skin where eyes should be. But it knew I was there. It knew I was watching." Sarah's hands began to shake again. "It stayed there for maybe 5 minutes, pressing against the window, running those things that weren't quite hands along the glass. And then it made a sound. Not quite a whistle, not quite a hiss. Like it was calling to something." "Calling?" "That's when the others came up from the river. I counted at least 6 of them, maybe more. They all gathered around my house, circling it like they were planning something. And they kept making that sound back and forth to each other. Like they were talking." I felt something cold and heavy settle in my chest. The pattern was escalating. First Mrs. Henderson's garden, then Jerry's building, now an active attempt to breach a home with someone inside. And Sarah's description of communication between the creatures suggested an intelligence that made everything infinitely more dangerous. "How long did they stay?" "Hours," Sarah said. "They didn't leave until just before dawn. I stayed awake the whole time, watching them through the curtains. They kept trying different windows, testing the doors. It was like they were learning the house, figuring out how to get inside." I spent the rest of the morning examining Sarah's property. The evidence was overwhelming and consistent with the previous incidents, but amplified. More drag marks, deeper impressions, and something new that made my skin crawl. Patches of ground around the house where the grass had died overnight, leaving behind dead circles about 3 feet in diameter. The dead grass was slimy to the touch, and gave off that same smell I'd first noticed at Mrs. Henderson's place. River water and decay with that metallic undertone that made your teeth ache. But there was something else mixed in now, something that reminded me of ozone, the way the air smells just before lightning strikes. That afternoon, I made a decision that probably saved lives, though I didn't know it at the time. I called a town meeting. The community center hadn't seen that many people since the high school graduation in June. Word had gotten around about the strange incidents, the way word always does in small towns, and folks were scared. You could see it in the way they sat, Families grouped together, chairs pulled closer than usual, everyone facing the exits. I stood at the front of the room and told them everything I knew. The timeline of incidents, the physical evidence, the witness testimonies. I could see the skepticism in some faces, especially among the newer residents who hadn't grown up with the old stories. But the long-time locals, the ones whose families had been here for generations, they listened with the quiet intensity of people who recognized something their ancestors had whispered about around winter fires. When I finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then old Pete Morrison stood up. Pete was 84 years old, born and raised in the house his grandfather had built in 1897. If anyone knew the deep history of our town, it was Pete. "Sheriff," Pete said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "My grandfather told me stories about things like this. Said they used to come up from the river every few decades, usually in October when the water was high and the moon was dark. Called them the thirsty ones." A murmur ran through the crowd. Several of the older residents were nodding, recognition dawning in their eyes. "What did your grandfather say about them?" I asked. Pete's face was grim. "Said they came looking for warmth. Human warmth. Body heat. They'd crawl up from the deep parts of the river where the water stays cold year-round, and they'd hunt for living things to drain." "Drain how?" "Touch," Pete said simply. "They'd touch you, and the warmth would flow out of you into them. Leave you cold as river stones, cold forever." Another voice spoke up from the back of the room. It was Martha Kellenberg, whose family had run the funeral home for 4 generations. "My great-grandmother kept records going back to the 1800s. Every 20 or 30 years, there'd be a spike in deaths during October. People found dead in their homes with no sign of violence, no apparent cause. Just cold. Body temperature so low it didn't register on thermometers." The room had gone completely silent now. Even the skeptics were listening with the kind of attention that comes when you realize the stories you've dismissed might be the very thing standing between you and something terrible. "What stopped them?" I asked. Pete and Martha exchanged glances. It was Pete who answered. "Fire," he said. "Light and heat. They can't abide either one. My grandfather said the old-timers used to burn bonfires along the riverbank during the hunting season, keep them burning all night long. Created a barrier the things couldn't cross." I thought about this for a moment. It made a certain kind of sense. If these creatures were drawn to warmth, perhaps they were also repelled by intense heat. But there was still one thing that bothered me. "Why now?" I asked. "If this happens every few decades, why haven't we seen them since?" 1963, Martha said quietly. "That was the last time. 7 people died that October, all found in their homes, all frozen from the inside out. But that was also the year they built the dam upstream. Changed the river's flow, lowered the water level in the deep pools." The pieces were starting to come together. The dam had been partially damaged in a flood the previous spring. Repair work had restored the water level to something approaching its historical norm, which meant the deep, cold places where these things apparently lived were once again accessible to the surface. I made the decision that night to organize watch groups. Volunteers would patrol the streets in shifts, carrying flares and battery-powered floodlights. We'd position the largest group near the river, with instructions to maintain a line of fire barriers along the bank from sunset to sunrise. But even as I made these preparations, I could feel something building in the air around town. A tension that made dogs pace and cats hide under porches. The kind of electric anticipation that comes before a storm, except this storm was crawling up from black water instead of falling from gray clouds. The attacks began 3 nights later. The first victim was Tom Brewster, who lived alone in a trailer about 50 yards from the river. Tom was 62 years old, a retired mechanic who kept to himself and rarely bothered anyone. His nearest neighbor found him the next morning when Tom failed to show up for their weekly coffee. Tom was sitting in his kitchen chair, fully clothed, with a cup of coffee still warm in his hands. But Tom himself was cold as January stone. The coroner later told me his core body temperature was 72 degrees, which should have been impossible for someone who'd been dead less than 8 hours. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry. But there were those familiar drag marks leading from the river to Tom's trailer, and the unmistakable impressions on his windows and doors. Whatever had killed Tom had spent time testing his defenses before finding a way inside. The second victim was found that same night. Lisa Chang, a 34-year-old teacher who lived in a small house on the edge of town. Same circumstances, no violence, no obvious cause of death, just a body drained of its warmth and life. But Lisa's house showed more extensive signs of the creature's presence. Every window had impressions on it, every door showed evidence of sustained pressure, and the ground around her home was marked with those dead circles of grass. The third victim we found just after midnight on the following night, and this one shook me to my core. It was Billy Hartman, age 9. Billy lived with his parents in a 2-story house on Maple Street, about 3 blocks from the river. His bedroom was on the 2nd floor, his window facing toward the water. When his mother went to wake him for school, she found him in his bed, covers pulled up to his chin, looking for all the world like he was sleeping peacefully. But Billy was cold. Cold as the October earth. Cold as river water in the deepest part of winter. The window in Billy's room was open. The screen had been removed from the outside and lay crumpled on the ground 20 feet below. On the windowsill were wet marks, as if something had dripped water while climbing through. But what made my hands shake as I examined the scene was what Billy's mother told me about the night before. He said he heard splashing. She whispered, tears streaming down her face. Said there were things in the river calling to him. I told him it was just his imagination, told him to go back to sleep. I thought about my grandmother's warning, about all the grandmother's warnings that had been passed down through generations of families in this town. Don't look out the window after midnight. Don't listen to the splashing. Don't answer when the river calls. All warnings that might have saved a 9-year-old boy if anyone had remembered to pass them on. That night, I made a decision that went against every instinct I had as a law enforcement officer. Instead of organizing search parties or calling in state police, I gathered the volunteers and told them we were going to build fires. Big fires. Hot fires. And we were going to keep them burning until this thing was over. We worked through the afternoon, collecting every piece of combustible material we could find. Scrap wood from construction sites, old furniture people donated from their attics, newspapers and cardboard boxes, even some of the wooden pallets from behind the grocery store. We built a line of bonfires along the riverbank, each one about 50 feet from the next, stretching for nearly a mile along the water's edge. As the sun set, we lit them all. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Orange light danced across the water, turning the river into a ribbon of fire. The heat was intense enough that you could feel it from 100 yards away, and the light was bright enough to read by even at the far edge of town. But more importantly, nothing came up from the water that night. We maintained the fire line for 6 nights, working in shifts to keep the flames burning bright. During the day, we'd collect more fuel and reinforce the barriers. At night, we'd stand guard with flares and floodlights, watching the river for any sign of movement. On the 7th night, something changed. I was taking the midnight shift, standing about 30 feet back from the largest of the bonfires, when I heard it. Not splashing this time, but something else. A sound like wind moving through water, or water moving through wind. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, A whisper that you felt more than heard. Then I saw them. They didn't come up from the river, the fires prevented that. Instead, they surfaced in the deeper water, maybe 50 feet from shore. Pale shapes breaking the surface tension, lingering just long enough to be seen before disappearing again. But they weren't approaching. They were watching. I counted at least a dozen, possibly more. Each time one surfaced, I could see that featureless face, that smooth expanse of skin where eyes should have been. But I could feel their attention like a physical weight, pressing against my mind with an intelligence that was ancient and patient and utterly alien. They stayed there for nearly an hour, rising and sinking in the dark water beyond the reach of our firelight. And then, just before dawn, they made that sound again, that not quite whistle, not quite hiss that Sarah had described. But this time it was different. Longer, more complex. Almost like a goodbye. I never saw them again. We maintained the fire line for another 2 weeks, just to be certain. But whatever had come up from the deep parts of the Blackwater River had returned to wherever such things wait between their visits to our world. The drag marks stopped appearing. The dead circles of grass began to grow back. The town slowly returned to something approaching normal. But normal is a relative term in a place like this. 3 families moved away within a month of the incidents. 2 more followed before Christmas. The hardware store closed when Jerry Milhouse decided he'd had enough of small-town life and relocated to Phoenix. Sarah Chin transferred to a hospital in the state capital and never looked back. Those of us who stayed learned to live with the knowledge of what lay beneath the surface of our quiet little river. We learned to pass on the old warnings to our children and grandchildren. We learned to keep a respectful distance from the water after dark, especially in October. And we learned to listen for the splashing. Because the thing about patterns is that they tend to repeat themselves. The dam won't last forever. Rivers have their own timescales, their own patience. What waits in the deep water can afford to be patient too. It's been 38 years since that October, and I'm getting close to retirement. My replacement is a good man, young and capable, but he didn't live through what happened in 1987. He doesn't carry the weight of those memories, doesn't wake up some nights with the sound of that alien communication echoing in his dreams. I worry about what will happen when I'm gone. Will the new sheriff believe the files I'm leaving behind? Will the town council maintain the emergency fire protocols we established? Will parents remember to tell their children about the importance of staying away from dark water after midnight? Or will the warnings fade into folklore, the way they almost did before? Will people start to think of the stories as quaint superstitions, harmless tales told by old-timers who've lived too long in isolation? I suppose we'll find out. The dam is showing its age these days. The Army Corps of Engineers has been talking about major repairs, possibly even reconstruction. When that happens, the river's flow will change again. The water level will rise and fall unpredictably. The deep, cold places will shift and expand. And something that has been waiting patiently in the dark will remember that it's been 38 years since the last hunt. 38 years since it tasted human warmth. 38 years of building hunger in the spaces between sleeping and waking. So I'll leave this account for whoever comes after me. I'll make sure the emergency protocols are documented and filed properly. I'll do my best to ensure the important warnings don't get lost in the transition from one generation of protectors to the next. But mostly, I'll hope that when the time comes, people will remember the most important lesson of all. If you hear splashing after midnight, don't look out the window. Because some things are better left unseen, some knowledge is too dangerous to possess, and some hungers are too ancient and patient to ever truly die. The river remembers everything. And everything in the river remembers us. End of recording. Case file #1987-10-001. Sheriff's Department, Blackwater County. Status: classified/restricted access.